Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you are here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe you are in bed already, maybe you are on the couch, maybe you are listening while the room around you has gone quiet and the day has finally stopped asking things from you. Tonight we're not going to a battlefield. We're not going to a royal court. We're not standing in front of a king while powdered ministers argue about taxes and treaties. We're going somewhere smaller than that, louder than that, and in some ways more important than that. We're going to a coffeehouse during the Age of Enlightenment, not the clean modern kind with soft chairs, pale wood counters, quiet music, and someone asking whether you want oat milk. Not a place where people sit alone behind laptops and pretend they are not checking the same 3 websites over and over. We're going to a room in the 1700s where the air is thick with smoke, candle grease, damp wool, ink, newsprint, roasted coffee, and men who have been talking for so long that the conversation itself feels like part of the furniture. We're going to step through a door at dusk, when the streets outside are turning dark, when the lamps are being lit, when the city is cooling down after a day of carts, bells, horses, bargaining, printing presses, street cries, and rainwater sitting in the cracks between the stones. And inside that room, for the price of a penny, a man could buy something that sounded very ordinary on the surface. A dish of coffee, a bench, a place near the fire. But what he was really buying was entry into one of the most restless spaces of the 18th century. A place where news arrived faster than it could be printed, where merchants arranged deals, where writers tested opinions, where philosophers sharpened arguments, where strangers interrupted one another without apology, and where the modern idea of public conversation began to take a shape that we would still recognise today. In 17th and 18th century England, coffeehouses became major places for politics, business, news, and debate, with London alone reaching perhaps hundreds of establishments by the first half of the 18th century. Now, before we step inside, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Is it late enough that the windows have turned dark and reflective, so that the room looks back at you? Or is it still early, with some of the day left around the edges? I ask because time matters in tonight's story. Evening mattered in the coffeehouse. It changed the room. During the day, men came and went with business on their minds. Messengers pushed through the door with letters. Brokers looked for clients. Printers looked for gossip. A merchant might stop in before visiting the Royal Exchange. A lawyer might appear between appointments. But evening gave the coffeehouse a different life. The pace did not exactly slow down. Coffeehouses were not quiet places. But after dusk, the room became more settled, more crowded, more smoky, more argumentative. Men who had spent the day in counting houses, shops, offices, courts and streets now had time to sit longer, to read the paper fully instead of glancing at it, to answer an insult, to test a theory, to hear what had happened in Parliament, what ship had arrived from Jamaica, what pamphlet had offended the bishop, what poet had made a fool of himself, what war might be coming, what stock might rise, what rumour was nonsense, and what rumour was worth money. We often imagine the Enlightenment as a shelf of books. Locke, Newton, Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, Rousseau. Heavy names, serious portraits, men looking off to the side as if someone has just asked them to define reason. But the Enlightenment was not only written at desks, it was also spoken aloud in public rooms by people with coffee on their breath and mud on their shoes. It was argued into shape by men who did not always listen well, did not always behave politely, and did not always know as much as they thought they knew. That is part of what makes the coffeehouse so human. It was not a temple of pure reason. It was a business. It was a room. It was a place where someone had to sweep the floor, boil the water, collect the money, replace broken cups, trim candles, and throw out men who had confused free discussion with shouting until midnight. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history not as a list of dates but as a door we can open slowly together, It would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it this second. Do it when you feel the room forming around you. Do it when something in this story makes you think about your own evening differently. And if you want to tell me where you are listening from, your city, your country, your couch, your kitchen, your small corner of the world, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. There is something fitting about that for this story, because the coffee house was built out of people telling one another where news had come from. A letter from Bristol, a ship from Lisbon, a traveller from Paris, a printer from Fleet Street, a clerk who swore he had heard something from a man who had it from another man who was close to someone important. That was how information moved, not cleanly. Not always accurately, but constantly. And the coffee house was one of the places where it gathered before spreading again. Let us begin with the door. That may sound too small a place to start, but in the 1700s doors mattered. A door divided kinds of people, kinds of behaviour, kinds of permission. Outside was the street, and the street in an 18th century city was not background. It was loud, dirty, useful, dangerous, crowded and alive. London especially was a city of constant movement, with coaches, wagons, horses, porters, chairmen carrying sedan chairs, apprentices, servants, sailors, hawkers, beggars, and gentlemen trying to keep their stockings clean while pretending not to notice the filth underfoot. The coffeehouse door opened into that world and also away from it. A man approaching in the evening might see candlelight through the window before he reached the threshold. He might smell the place before he entered it. Coffee in the 18th century did not taste like the coffee most of us know. It could be bitter, badly roasted, boiled too long, thick with grounds, and served without the careful measurements that modern people have somehow turned into a moral identity. Some early writers described it with open disgust, but they drank it anyway because it did something ale did not do. It sharpened. It woke. It allowed men to sit for hours and keep talking. Coffee first became popular in England partly because people praised its stimulating effects and saw it as an alternative to the drunkenness of taverns and alehouses. That contrast mattered more than we sometimes realise. Before the coffee house became fashionable, much of English social life for ordinary men outside the home happened in places where alcohol was central. Taverns, inns, alehouses. Those places did not disappear, and we should not imagine a sudden moral revolution where everyone set down their beer, picked up a cup of coffee, and became reasonable. Human beings do not change that neatly. But the coffee house offered a different kind of public room. It advertised itself, at least in theory, as sober. Men came there to read, talk, learn, trade, dispute, and be seen doing those things. The absence of alcohol was part of the point. A man could disagree with another man and claim he was doing it in the service of reason, rather than because the bottle had made him brave. Of course, the result was not always calm. Anyone who thinks sober people cannot be foolish has never watched two men argue about politics after convincing themselves they are both the voice of common sense. Still, the coffeehouse created a public setting in which conversation itself became the main attraction. That was new enough to matter. The first English coffeehouses appeared in Oxford and London in the 1650s, and the London coffeehouse often associated with Pasqua Rosé opened at St Michael's Alley, Cornhill, in 1652. That date is worth keeping in mind because it places the coffeehouse before the Enlightenment had fully acquired the shape we now give it. These rooms were not created after the great ideas had already appeared. They were part of the conditions that allowed those ideas to circulate. In Oxford, coffeehouses gained the nickname penny universities because a penny could buy a man access to coffee and conversation that might include scholars, students, travellers, and people who wanted to sound like all three. Think about that for a moment. A penny university. The phrase is charming, but it is also a little misleading. It makes the place sound more generous and open than it really was. A penny did not erase rank. It did not make a poor man equal to a wealthy one in any deep way. It did not welcome women as full participants in most English coffeehouses, and it did not mean the servant carrying cups had the same freedom to speak as the gentleman reading the paper. But the phrase still tells us something real. It tells us that people recognise the coffeehouse as a place where knowledge could be encountered outside a formal school, outside a church, outside a court, outside a private library. You did not need to own the newspaper if the coffeehouse had it. You did not need to be invited to a nobleman's dinner if the argument was already happening at the long table. You did not need to know a famous writer personally to hear someone repeat what he had said yesterday at Wills or Buttons. For a city man with a little money and enough confidence to enter the room, the coffeehouse offered access to a world of talk. Let us imagine him now. Not a philosopher, not one of the famous names, just a man in London around the middle of the 18th century. He has finished the day's work. Maybe he is a clerk, the kind of man whose fingers smell faintly of ink and whose back aches from leaning over ledgers. Maybe he works for a merchant near the river. Maybe he's a printer's assistant with black under his nails. Maybe he is an apprentice who has saved the penny and is trying very hard to look as if he belongs among older men. His coat is damp because the weather has been unhelpful, which in London is not a remarkable historical event. He steps into the coffeehouse, and the first thing that hits him is the closeness of the air. There are too many bodies in the room and not enough clean air for all of them. Tobacco smoke hangs near the ceiling. Candles burn with small, unsteady flames. The fire is doing what it can. Cups clatter. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone else coughs with the deep confidence of a man who has been breathing smoke since childhood and sees no reason to stop now. The floor is worn. The tables are marked. Newspapers lie folded, unfolded, refolded, stained, and passed from hand to hand. A man near the wall is reading aloud because not everyone has the paper in front of him, and even those who can read often prefer to hear the news performed. Reading aloud turns information into an event. It gives men a reason to interrupt. This is one of the most important things to understand about the 18th century coffeehouse. It was not quiet reading. It was not the polite hush of a library. It was closer to a market of sentences. News, opinion, jokes, lies, corrections, prices, poems, insults, advertisements, ship arrivals, parliamentary whispers, and arguments about religion all moved through the same air. Coffeehouses supplied newspapers and printed material to customers, and fresh editions could be passed around or read aloud to spark discussion. That one fact changes the room. A newspaper in a private house informs a household. A newspaper in a coffeehouse becomes a public object. It is handled, disputed, doubted, explained, exaggerated, and attached to the memory of whoever read it first. A man might enter knowing nothing except that he wanted coffee, and leave believing he understood the condition of Europe. He might be wrong, but that has never stopped anyone from leaving a public room with confidence. The coffeehouse owner understood this. He was not merely selling coffee. He was selling access to information and company. He was selling the possibility that something might be heard here before it was heard elsewhere. Some coffeehouses became known for particular interests. One might attract merchants and insurers. Another might attract writers. Another might be associated with political factions. Another might be useful if you wanted shipping news, colonial news, stock prices, or literary gossip. Lloyd's Coffeehouse became associated with merchants, shippers, and marine insurance, while Jonathan's Coffeehouse is linked to the early history of stock trading in London. This means that choosing a coffeehouse was not always casual. A man went where the people he needed could be found. The building itself became part office, part exchange, part newsroom, part club, part classroom, part theatre, and part trap for anyone who could not resist an argument. There is a modern habit of praising coffeehouses as if they were perfectly open spaces of democratic reason, and we should be careful with that. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. They did bring together men of different ranks more freely than many older institutions. The long communal tables encouraged conversation among people who might not otherwise have spoken. Strangers could address one another. A tradesman could hear a gentleman's opinion. A writer could test a phrase in public. A merchant could gather intelligence from people outside his usual circle. But this openness had limits. Many coffeehouses were overwhelmingly male. Women were often excluded as customers in English coffeehouse culture, though women worked in and around these spaces, served in them, owned some related businesses, appeared in satire about them, and were affected by the conversations that took place there. Class mattered. Clothing mattered. Accent mattered. Confidence mattered. The man who entered had to know how to behave, or at least how to imitate behaviour long enough not to be laughed out of the room. Even in a place that claimed to value wit over birth, birth still had a way of finding a chair near the fire. And yet, for all its exclusions, the coffeehouse did something that still deserves our attention. It moved serious conversation into public life. Not all serious conversation, and not always good conversation, but enough of it to matter. It made current events part of ordinary evening sociability. It trained people to expect news. It trained them to respond to printed arguments quickly. It created audiences for pamphlets and periodicals. It rewarded men who could speak well, write sharply, and keep up with the subject of the day. Publications such as The Tatler and The Spectator drew heavily on coffeehouse culture and helped shape early 18th century public conversation with mixtures of news, gossip, moral comment, and social observation. The coffeehouse did not invent public opinion by itself. No single room did that, but it gave public opinion somewhere to sit down. I want you to think about how strange that would feel if you were used to an older world where information moved through church proclamations, official notices, market gossip, private letters, and the slow authority of printed books. Then suddenly there is a room where the latest paper has arrived and a dozen men are treating it as the beginning of the evening's work. Not work in the sense of labour with tools, but work in the sense of forming judgment. What do we think of this? Is the ministry failing? Is the war profitable? Is the new tax foolish? Is that sermon dangerous? Is Newton right? Is the price of sugar going to rise? Has France moved? Has the ship been lost? Is this pamphlet treason or common sense? Those questions did not stay in books. They became spoken things. They became social tests. A man revealed himself by how he answered. Too cautious, and he looked dull. Too bold, and he might attract attention from people he did not want noticing him. Too ignorant, and the room would know. Too clever, and the room might resent him. This is where the evening becomes especially alive. Daytime coffeehouse business could be brisk and practical, but evening allowed talk to stretch. Men had time to perform themselves. That is not a modern invention. People in the 18th century were very aware of being watched. The coffeehouse gave them an audience. The man who spoke well could become known. The man who knew the latest news could gather listeners. The man who had read the newest pamphlet could summarise it for others and improve it in the telling, because very few human beings can repeat an argument without making themselves slightly more important inside it. A young writer could sit quietly, listen to older men, and learn what made people laugh. A merchant could pretend to be there for conversation while waiting for one specific person to arrive with one specific piece of information. A spy could sit in the corner and look like a bored customer. A government informer did not need a dark alley if men were willing to say dangerous things loudly over coffee. That is another point worth sitting with. The coffeehouse was public enough to spread ideas and public enough to be watched. The same openness that made it exciting made it vulnerable. Authorities understood very well that rooms full of men discussing politics could become troublesome. In 1675, Charles II's government issued a proclamation attempting to suppress coffeehouses, complaining that they spread false and malicious reports, though the measure was quickly withdrawn after opposition. The later 18th century remained full of anxiety about political talk, pamphlets, and crowds. When men gathered to discuss government, government listened back. This gives the coffeehouse a different edge. It was not simply cosy. It was not just smoke and wit and newspapers. It had risk in it. especially when conversation moved from trade to politics, from politics to criticism, from criticism to something that sounded like sedition if repeated by the wrong person. But let us not rush too quickly into danger, because part of what made the coffeehouse powerful was how ordinary it felt to the people inside. A man did not necessarily enter thinking, "I am participating in the Enlightenment." People rarely understand their own lives in the tidy labels that historians later give them. He entered because he wanted news, warmth, coffee, company, business, amusement, or escape from a cramped lodging where there was nothing to read and no one interesting to contradict. The Enlightenment, from inside the evening itself, may have felt less like an age of reason and more like a crowded room where everyone had an opinion at the same time. That does not make it less important. It makes it easier to understand. Big historical changes often arrive disguised as habits. Going out for coffee, reading the paper, arguing with strangers, repeating a joke from a periodical, checking the shipping news, asking what they're saying at another coffee house. These small actions, repeated thousands of times by thousands of people, created a culture in which ideas could move quickly and publicly. The man we have been following finds a place on a bench if he is lucky. If not, he stands near the wall with his dish of coffee and listens. The coffee may be served in a small bowl or dish rather than the modern mug you are picturing. It is hot enough to make him cautious, and bitter enough to remind him that fashion does not always taste good. Near him, two older men are arguing about the ministry. Across the room, someone is reading from a paper and pausing whenever the room interrupts him, which is often. A servant moves through the crowd with the practiced irritation of someone who has learned that educated men are not easier to serve than anyone else. A printer's boy arrives with something fresh. Heads turn. This is how a room changes. Not with music, not with ceremony, but with paper. The new sheet is unfolded. The ink may still be slightly damp. Someone asks for the date before he asks for the contents, because stale news is almost an insult. Then the reading begins, and for a few minutes the room leans toward one voice. Outside, the city continues in darkness. Inside, the coffeehouse holds its own kind of light. Not bright light. Nothing like the light we use without thinking. Candlelight and firelight were limited, expensive, and uneven. Faces would appear and disappear in smoke and shadow. The corners of the room would be harder to read than the faces near the table. This matters because Enlightenment conversation did not happen in the clean brightness of modern lecture halls. It happened in rooms where men squinted at print, where candles had to be trimmed, where the smell of burning tallow mingled with coffee and tobacco, where a spilled dish could stain a paper that 3 other men were waiting to read. We sometimes make the past too neat. We polish it until the dirt is gone, and then we wonder why it feels dead. The coffeehouse was not dead. It was irritating, warm, crowded, uneven, and alive in the way places become alive when people believe they may hear something useful before the night is over. There is a small modern comparison that helps, though it is not perfect. Imagine if your news feed, your office break room, your group chat, your podcast queue, your local newspaper, your social media argument, your business meeting, and your favourite cafe were all squeezed into one smoky room where everyone could see your face while you reacted. That is closer to the 18th century coffeehouse than the gentle image of philosophers quietly improving mankind. It was social media before electricity, but slower, more physical, and harder to escape once someone turned to you and asked what you thought. There was no anonymous comment from a dark bedroom. Your coat, your voice, your manners, your hesitation, your confidence, and your ignorance all arrived with you. That made conversation more accountable in some ways and more theatrical in others. A man could not simply post an opinion and walk away. He had to sit there while someone older, richer, funnier, or better informed took it apart in front of the room. And still they came back. Night after night, men returned to these places because the coffeehouse offered what many people have always wanted from public life. The feeling of being close to events, close to news, close to intelligence, close to people who knew things, close to arguments that made ordinary life feel connected to a larger world. In a period of expanding trade, colonial empire, scientific discovery, religious debate, financial speculation, and political conflict, that feeling mattered. The world was becoming harder to understand, and the coffeehouse promised, however falsely, that understanding might be available if you sat in the right place long enough and listened carefully enough. So tonight, as we begin, do not picture the Enlightenment as a clean white room with a philosopher standing at a lectern. Picture a door opening at dusk. Picture a man stepping in from a wet London street. Picture him paying his penny. Picture the heat touching his face before he has fully entered. Picture the scrape of benches, the uneven candlelight, the dark liquid being poured, the papers moving hand to hand, the first argument already underway before he has found a seat. Somewhere in that room, a young man is hearing an idea he will repeat tomorrow. Somewhere else, a merchant is learning news that will change a price. A writer is storing a phrase. A government watcher is remembering a name. A servant is trying not to spill coffee on a gentleman who thinks his opinion is worth more than it is. And over all of it hangs the ordinary noise of an evening that no one in the room thinks of as history yet. The door is opened. The room is full. The penny has been paid. And before we can understand the arguments, the newspapers, the famous names, the exclusions, the business deals, and the strange new confidence that ordinary men had begun to feel when they spoke in public, we need to understand that penny itself, because that small coin did something remarkable. It did not make everyone equal, and it did not make knowledge free, but it brought a seat close enough to the conversation that a man could begin to imagine the world was something he had the right to discuss. The penny has been paid, and that is where this evening really begins. It is such a small thing to picture that we almost miss its importance. One coin passed across a counter or dropped into the hand of a coffeehouse keeper, and in return a man receives a dish of coffee, a place to sit if there is space, the right to hear the news, and the temporary permission to belong to a room that is larger than his own life. That is the part worth slowing down for. The drink mattered, of course. Coffee was still unusual enough in early English coffeehouse culture to feel connected to travel, trade, medicine, fashion and foreignness all at once. But the penny was not really just paying for coffee, it was paying for nearness. Nearness to paper, nearness to rumour, nearness to men who knew prices before others did. Nearness to arguments that could make a clerk feel for an hour as if he stood close to the machinery of the world. In 17th and 18th century England, coffeehouses were often described as places where one penny could buy admission, coffee, newspapers, and conversation, which is why the nickname penny universities became attached to them, especially in Oxford and later in the wider imagination of English coffeehouse culture. That phrase has survived because it is useful, but it needs to be handled carefully. It is tempting to say that the coffeehouse was democratic, that any man with a penny could walk in and become the equal of a scholar, a merchant, a lawyer, or a wit. That is not quite true. The 18th century did not stop being hierarchical because coffee had arrived. A shabby coat was still noticed. A rural accent could still mark a man as provincial. A servant could carry coffee through the room all night and still not be treated as a participant in the conversation he overheard. A woman might own, serve in, or be discussed inside a coffeehouse, and still not be welcomed as a regular speaker among the men at the table. So no, the penny did not abolish rank. It did something subtler, and in some ways more interesting. It rented a small portion of public presence. It allowed a man, for the length of an evening, to stand close enough to knowledge that he could feel its heat. Picture the coin itself for a moment. It is not an impressive object. It does not announce a fortune. It does not open the door to a private club or a fashionable assembly room, where admission depends on birth, patronage, and the delicate approval of people who have been trained since childhood to recognise outsiders. It is a common coin, handled by many hands before his. It has passed through markets, taverns, shops, pockets, tills, and perhaps the collection plate at church. The man carrying it may have considered how many he had left before spending it. That is something modern people often miss when we hear a penny. The word sounds almost meaningless now, so small that we leave pennies in jars or drawers or little trays by cash registers. But in the 18th century, a penny still had weight in the decisions of ordinary people. It was not a fortune, but it was not nothing. To spend one on coffee meant choosing the coffee house over some other small necessity or pleasure. It meant deciding that the room was worth entering. That decision depended on what sort of man he was. For a wealthy merchant, the penny was not the point at all. He was paying for the flow of commercial intelligence, for a place where shipping news, insurance talk and information about goods and credit moved quickly from mouth to mouth. For a lawyer or writer, the room might be a stage where reputation could be improved by a clever line or damaged by a foolish one. For a clerk, the penny could feel like an investment in self-improvement, or at least in being able to repeat tomorrow what better-informed men had said tonight. For an apprentice, it might be a small act of ambition, a way of sitting near adult talk and learning how men sounded when they believed the affairs of Europe were available for their judgment. For a printer's worker or pamphlet seller, the room was not only a place to listen, but a place to discover what people were prepared to read. Every one of them paid the same small sum at the door, but they were not all buying the same thing. This is where the coffee house begins to look less like a shop and more like a machine. You put in a penny, and something starts moving. News comes toward you. Opinions come toward you. Contradictions come toward you. You're expected to receive them quickly, answer if challenged, laugh if the room laughs, show surprise without seeming ignorant, and know when silence is safer than speech. The coffee house had rules, even when those rules were not written down. A man could not behave as he did in his own kitchen. He could not sprawl like a lord unless he had the social force to make the room accept it. He could not take the newspaper and keep it to himself all evening without irritating the people waiting for it. He could not assume that his private anger mattered to strangers. He had to learn the rhythm of public talk, and that was part of what the penny purchased. Not just information, but training. That training mattered because public conversation itself was becoming more important. The 17th century had been filled with political crisis, civil war, restoration, religious conflict, scientific inquiry, commercial expansion, and the growth of print. By the 18th century, many urban people were living in a world where events far away could affect prices, reputations, offices, taxes, wars, and fortunes. A ship delayed in the Caribbean, a war rumour from the continent, a speech in Parliament, a pamphlet attack, a new tax proposal, a royal illness, a colonial rebellion, a bank failure, an election, an execution, a sermon, a scientific demonstration. All of these could become coffeehouse talk. And once something became coffeehouse talk, it entered a strange middle state. It was not private anymore, but it was not always official either. It existed in that unsettled zone where news, gossip, speculation and argument mixed together, until men began repeating it as if repetition itself had made it solid. The owner of the coffee house understood this better than anyone. He might not have called himself an educator, and in most cases he was not one. He was a businessman. The room had to pay. Coffee had to be purchased, roasted, boiled, served, spilled, replaced. Candles had to be bought. Fires had to be maintained. Cups broke. Benches wore down. Newspapers and pamphlets cost money. Servants had to be managed. Quarrels had to be contained before they became bad for business. But a successful coffeehouse keeper knew that the true attraction of his establishment was not the taste of the drink. It was the quality of the company and the freshness of the information. If his room had the best papers, the quickest letters, the most reliable commercial reports, or the liveliest talk, men would return. A coffeehouse could become known for the kind of intelligence it gathered. This was not accidental, it was the business model. Some coffeehouses became famous because they served particular communities. Lloyd's Coffee House, opened by Edward Lloyd in the late 17th century, became closely associated with sailors, ship owners, merchants, shipping news, and marine insurance. Lloyd's of London and Lloyd's List trace their histories back to this coffeehouse world of maritime intelligence. This is a perfect example of what the penny could actually buy. A man at Lloyd's was not merely warming himself with coffee. He was standing in a room where the sea, in all its danger and profit, had been translated into talk. Which ships had arrived, which were overdue, which cargoes were insured, which captain had a reputation, which waters were dangerous, which war might make a voyage more profitable or ruinous. Information that once moved through private letters and narrow merchant circles could become semi-public among men who knew how to use it. A cup on the table, a newspaper nearby, and suddenly the Atlantic feels a little closer to Lombard Street. There is a similar story with financial coffeehouses. Jonathan's Coffeehouse in Exchange Alley became associated with stock jobbers and securities trading, helping form the environment from which more formal financial institutions would later develop. The modern world of exchanges, insurance, speculation, and financial news did not begin in a quiet office with clean paper and glass doors. It began in crowded rooms where men listened for names, prices, rumours, and confidence. That last one matters most. Confidence is one of the strangest forces in economic life. A ship can exist, a cargo can exist, a debt can exist. But confidence is a shared feeling that men persuade one another to have. Coffeehouses were good places for that persuasion. A man could look another man in the face and decide whether he trusted him, or decide that enough other people seemed to trust him, which has often been considered almost the same thing until it suddenly is not. This also made coffeehouses dangerous. A rumour could move through one of these rooms with the speed of appetite. A whisper about a shipwreck, a treaty, a bankruptcy, a change in government policy, or a failed expedition could alter decisions before anyone knew whether it was true. The same room that educated could mislead. The same penny that brought access to knowledge also brought access to error. That is a point worth keeping because it makes the coffeehouse feel much closer to us. We sometimes imagine misinformation as a modern disease born from screens, but human beings were perfectly capable of spreading uncertain information in candlelit rooms with cups in their hands. The difference was speed and scale, not the basic habit. Then as now, men often believed what arrived with urgency, what came from a confident speaker, what matched their interests, or what gave them the pleasure of knowing something before others did. Still, the possibility of error did not reduce the attraction. It may have increased it. A room where every statement is already confirmed can be useful, but a room where something might be breaking is exciting. Coffeehouses fed that excitement. They were linked to the expansion of newspapers, pamphlets, handwritten newsletters, and oral reports, and historians have described them as part library, part debating room, and major centres for reading and distributing news in early modern England. This means the penny did not buy only a drink and a chair. It bought access to shared reading. That is different from private reading. Shared reading has a social pressure built into it. When a man reads alone, he can pause, misunderstand, reread, be bored, skip a section, or change his mind in privacy. When news is read aloud in a coffeehouse, comprehension becomes public. The room reacts before each man has fully decided what he thinks. A laugh can instruct him. A groan can warn him. A sharp objection can steer the meaning of a paragraph. The newspaper is not merely consumed, it is performed. Imagine the paper arriving. Someone near the door recognizes the boy who brings it and calls out before anyone has opened it. A few men turn from their conversations. One man complains that yesterday's report was wrong. Another asks whether there is any word from the fleet. A third wants Parliament. A fourth wants advertisements, because buried in advertisements are auctions, lost goods, runaway servants, books for sale, medicines, lectures, sales of estates, and the small practical notices by which a city understands itself. The paper is unfolded, and the reader begins. He may be chosen because he has a strong voice, or because he reached it first, or because he's the sort of man who believes all rooms are improved by his voice. As he reads, the paper becomes communal property, not legally perhaps, but socially. A man at the far end asks him to repeat a line. Someone says the report came from a ministerial paper and should not be trusted. Someone else says that is exactly what makes it useful, because lies from government reveal what government fears. Another man mutters that fools can find conspiracy in a weather report. The room warms. This is why the term penny university had power, not because the coffee house offered disciplined instruction, but because learning in that room came through exposure. You heard names repeatedly until you knew them. You learned the geography of war by listening to men argue over places you had never seen. You learned commerce by hearing merchants complain about delays. You learned politics by watching which topics made men lower their voices. You learned style by noticing who held attention and who lost it. You learned caution by seeing someone say too much. No one handed you a syllabus. There were no exams except the immediate examination of the room. If you spoke nonsense, someone might correct you. If you spoke well, someone might remember you. Both outcomes had value. The social mixture of the coffee house was never as complete as its admirers claimed, but it was unusual enough to be noticed. Historians of 18th century sociability emphasise that British coffee houses were real spaces of social interaction, and also imagined spaces where ideals of polite, urban discussion could be performed, even if the reality often fell short. That phrase, polite discussion, can sound gentler than the room probably was. Politeness in the 18th century did not mean softness. It meant controlled behaviour, recognisable manners, an ability to dispute without seeming vulgar, at least when the dispute was going well. A coffee-house argument could be fierce, but the men inside often cared about appearing rational while they disagreed. That appearance mattered. The Enlightenment did not simply teach people to think. It also taught many of them to present themselves as thinking people. The coffee house rewarded that presentation. There is something faintly comic about this, and we should allow it to be comic because the people of the past were not solemn statues. A man might enter the coffee house believing he was there to improve his mind and spend most of the evening repeating gossip about a poet's debts. Another might denounce luxury. While enjoying imported coffee sweetened with sugar produced within imperial systems of labour and trade, he preferred not to examine too closely. A third might speak at length about liberty while expecting servants to move silently around him. This was the Enlightenment too. Not only principles but contradictions. Not only reason, but vanity wearing reason's coat. Not only the birth of public opinion, but the birth of 1,000 men discovering that having an opinion in public can feel very much like importance. The penny encouraged that feeling because it lowered the threshold of entry. A man did not need to host a salon. He did not need to belong to a university. He did not need to own a library. He did not need to publish a book. He only needed enough money, the proper gender in most English contexts, the courage to walk in, and some ability to endure the room. Once inside, he could listen to people who had read more than he had. He could borrow their certainty for an evening. He could repeat a phrase the next day in another setting, and sound better informed than he had been. In that way, coffee houses redistributed not knowledge exactly, but the appearance and fragments of knowledge. Those fragments mattered. A public culture does not grow only from masterpieces. It grows from summaries, quotations, misunderstandings, jokes, borrowed phrases, half-read essays, remembered lines, and men saying, "I heard last night at the coffee house." That sentence must have carried real weight. I heard it at the coffee house? It suggested proximity to a source, even when the source was unclear. It implied the speaker had been present where informed people gathered. It made news feel social rather than distant. This is one of the quiet powers of the coffee house. It gave information a location. In our own world, information often seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A headline appears on a screen. A message arrives. A clip circulates without context. In the 18th century, a man could associate information with a place in a speaker. He could say he heard it at Garraway's, or Will's, or Lloyd's, or Button's, or the Chapter. Each name carried an atmosphere. Each room had a reputation. The place itself lent colour to the report. Coffeehouse names mattered because the city was too large for any one room to contain everything. London's coffeehouses formed a network of specialised publics. Literary men had their haunts. Merchants had theirs. Clergymen, physicians, politicians, booksellers, actors, critics, stock jobbers, foreign travellers, and idlers all knew where certain conversations were likely to happen. The penny then bought entry not only into the coffeehouse but into a chosen current of the city's intelligence. A man selected his room according to what he wanted to become near. If he wanted poetry, he did not go where shipping insurance dominated the talk. If he wanted shipping news, he didn't waste his evening among men arguing over a line of satire. If he wanted politics, he chose a room where politics could be heard and where the danger of hearing it was part of the appeal. That danger was not imaginary. Governments were wary of coffeehouses because they gathered men, spread reports, and made authority available for criticism in ordinary speech. Charles II's government attempted to suppress coffeehouses in 1675, complaining about false, malicious, and scandalous reports, but the attempt was withdrawn quickly after resistance. The failure of that suppression tells us something important. By the time authorities tried to close the rooms, coffeehouses had already become woven into urban life. They were too useful, too popular, too connected to business, news, and sociability to remove easily. A state might fear them, but merchants needed them. Writers needed them. Politicians used them even while complaining about them. Men who disliked coffeehouse talk still wanted access to what it produced. That is how institutions become powerful before anyone has formally named their power. Still, do not picture the penny as a key that opened every door without friction. There was always the question of belonging. A man entering a coffeehouse for the first time would have felt it in his body. Where does he stand? Does he sit without invitation? Does he speak? Does he wait? Does he call for coffee first, or listen first? Does he take up the paper if it is lying near him, or would that seem presumptuous? Public rooms have invisible maps. Regulars know them without thinking. Newcomers discover them by making small mistakes. The 18th century coffeehouse was no different. A man could pay the penny and still remain outside the inner life of the room. He could sit near the conversation and not yet be trusted by it. Access is not the same as acceptance. That distinction runs through the whole history of public life. The coffeehouse keeper watched these things. He knew who paid, who owed, who spent freely, who lingered too long over one dish, who drew customers, who drove them away, who brought news, who started quarrels, who could be useful. A good regular was worth more than his penny because he made the room attractive. A man with reliable foreign letters, a sharp wit, or a reputation for knowing parliamentary whispers could become part of the coffeehouse's value. The keeper sold coffee, but the customer supplied much of the product. That is one of the cleverest things about the institution. The patrons paid to enter and then produced the atmosphere that made others want to pay. The newspaper worked the same way. The coffeehouse bought it, but the men animated it. The pamphlet sat on a table, but the room turned it into controversy. A printed essay could travel farther because people who had not purchased it heard it summarised and disputed aloud. Addison and Steele understood this culture when they wrote The Tatler and The Spectator in the early 18th century. Those periodicals drew on coffeehouse settings, gossip, moral commentary, and public sociability, with The Spectator becoming one of the famous voices of early 18th century print culture. This matters because print and coffeehouse talk fed each other. Papers gave the room subjects. The room gave papers audiences. A witty observation made in print could return to speech. A scandal whispered in speech could become print. The boundary between reading and talking became thin. Think about the ordinary man again. He may not have read Locke carefully. He may not have understood Newton beyond the fact that respectable men spoke of him with admiration. He may never have opened a volume of Voltaire or followed a philosophical argument to its end. But in the coffee house he learned that ideas had public force. He learned that printed arguments could disturb a room. He learned that government could be discussed by men who did not govern. He learned that trade linked his city to oceans and colonies and wars. He learned that knowledge was not only stored in universities and private libraries, but circulated through habits. This is not a small thing. The Enlightenment depended not only on thinkers, but on circulation. A thought locked in one study remains small. A thought printed, discussed, mocked, misunderstood, defended and repeated begins to live socially. The penny helped pay for that circulation. There is another side to the coin, and it is less flattering. The penny also bought men a place away from home. This may sound obvious, but it mattered. Coffee houses were often male spaces, and part of their appeal was that they offered men an evening world outside domestic obligations. Wives criticised them in satire. Moralists worried about them. Employers may have resented the time apprentices spent in them. A man who sat for hours in a coffee house was not necessarily improving society. He might simply be avoiding his household, neglecting business, spending money, cultivating vanity, or enjoying the sound of his own opinions. The same institution that helped spread public debate also gave cover to idleness. Critics noticed this. They mocked coffeehouse men as people who mistook talk for action and information for wisdom. The criticism was not entirely unfair. But even that idleness has historical importance. A society in which more men can spend time talking about public affairs, even foolishly, is changing. Leisure or semi-leisure becomes part of politics and culture. The evening hour that might once have been spent in drink, household quiet, or private reading becomes attached to public discussion. The penny creates a ritual. Finish the day. Walk to the coffee house, pay, sit, listen, speak, repeat. Over time, rituals train expectations. Men begin to expect news daily. They expect to comment on it. They expect others to have heard the same reports. They expect that public affairs are a proper subject for ordinary conversation. Once that expectation exists, it is difficult to make it disappear. A single evening inside the coffee house may seem small. One man, one coin, one cup, one newspaper read aloud under wavering candlelight. But repeat that scene across decades and across cities, and the scale changes. The coffee house becomes part of the infrastructure of modern public life. Not the only part, never the whole explanation, but one of the rooms in which habits of modernity were practiced before anyone would have used that word. Paying attention to news, disputing authority, treating strangers as temporary conversation partners, linking commerce with information, measuring oneself through opinion, confusing confidence with understanding, learning faster than older institutions could manage. These habits did not all begin in coffee houses, but coffee houses gave them a place to happen regularly. By now our man has been in the room long enough for his coffee to cool. He may have forgotten to drink the last of it. The surface is dark and bitter. A ring has formed where the dish sits on the table. He has heard 3 reports he believes, 2 he doubts, and 1 he will repeat tomorrow despite doubting it because it is too interesting to waste. He has laughed once when others laughed, a little late, hoping no one noticed. He has learned the name of a pamphlet he now wants to find. He has watched an older man destroy a younger man's argument with 1 dry sentence. He has seen a merchant quietly leave after hearing something about a ship. He has noticed that 1 gentleman near the fire says very little, but everyone listens when he does. He has begun to understand the room's order. That understanding is part of what he purchased. The penny did not make him powerful, but it placed him near power of a particular kind. Not the power of armies or laws or inherited titles, but the power of circulation, the power of being among those who hear, interpret, and repeat. This is easy to underestimate until we remember how much of history moves through repetition. A rumour repeated becomes pressure. An argument repeated becomes opinion. A phrase repeated becomes common sense. A price repeated becomes a market signal. A suspicion repeated becomes a political problem. The coffeehouse gathered repetitions and gave them speed. Outside, the street has grown darker. More men arrive with wet shoulders and cold hands. Someone shifts on a bench to make room, or refuses to, depending on his mood. The fire throws uneven light across the walls. The papers are no longer crisp. They have been folded badly and handled by too many fingers. The room is warmer now, heavier with breath and smoke. The first penny bought entry, but the evening is beginning to demand more than entry. It demands endurance. The noise thickens. Candles need trimming. Tobacco burns down. Coffee is poured again. Someone calls for the latest paper. Someone else begins a story from another coffeehouse, which may or may not be true, but the men nearby lean in anyway because truth is not the only thing that makes a story useful. The small coin has done its work. It has brought him inside. Now the room itself takes over, with its candles, its smoke, its bitter drink, its damp wool, its ink-stained papers, and the steady rising sound of men convincing themselves that the world can be understood if only they keep talking long enough. The first thing the room gives him is not conversation. It is heat. Not the clean, steady warmth of a modern building, not the invisible comfort that arrives from vents in the wall and asks nothing of anyone, but a thick, uneven warmth made by fire, bodies, candles, boiling water, wet clothing, and air that has nowhere good to go. He feels it on his face before he understands the room with his eyes. His coat is still damp at the shoulders. His shoes have brought in street mud. His hands are cold enough that the dish of coffee feels almost medicinal when it reaches him. Around him, the coffeehouse is doing what coffeehouses did best in the evening. It is filling itself. Men come in with the weather still on them. Hats are shaken, coats are brushed, complaints are made. A door opens too often and lets in a slice of cold air, then shuts again, and the room absorbs another customer into its smoke and candlelight. The candlelight matters because it controls what the coffeehouse looks like after dusk. We're so used to being able to see everything that we forget how much of the past happened in partial light. Not darkness exactly, not in a busy coffeehouse, but not brightness either. The room is lit in pockets. A candle on a table shows the paper beneath it and the hands around it. A fire catches the side of a face and leaves the other side unreadable. A hanging lamp gives just enough light to see a doorway, and not quite enough to see whether the man entering is someone you owe money to. The ceiling is lost in smoke. The corners are not empty, but they look like they might be. Men move through this half-light with the confidence of people who know the room by habit rather than by clear sight. They know which bench has a broken leg. They know which table sits too close to the draught. They know where the regulars gather. They know where a stranger should not sit unless he enjoys being noticed for the wrong reason. The candles themselves are not decorative. No one has placed them there to make the evening feel charming. They are tools, and expensive tools at that. In many ordinary households of the period, candles were rationed carefully, but a coffeehouse had to burn light as part of its trade. A room that sells reading, conversation, newspapers and presents cannot sink too far into darkness without losing the very thing men have paid for. So the candles burn, and with them comes another layer of smell. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, smoke and gutter if not maintained. They need snuffing, that small act of trimming the charred wick so the flame does not smoke itself into uselessness. In a room filled with customers, the candles are constantly in danger of becoming either too low or too smoky, and someone must notice. A servant moves through with snuffers, quick and practiced, leaning between shoulders, clipping the wick, correcting the flame, and withdrawing before some man spills his argument along with his coffee. There is a small dignity in that work that most of the customers do not see. The men at the table may be debating trade, liberty, religion, monarchy, the new philosophy, the value of reason, the stupidity of the ministry, or the price of sugar. But the room itself depends on people who are not part of the debate. Someone has boiled the water. Someone has prepared the coffee. Someone has carried cups through a crowd that does not make way quickly. Someone has cleaned the table after the last men left rings of liquid and ash on it. Someone has kept the fire alive, watched the candles, opened the door to late arrivals, and understood that an evening of enlightened conversation still requires a great deal of ordinary labour. That is one of the useful correctives to how we imagine the Age of Enlightenment. It did not float above the practical world, it sat inside it. Reason needed light, and light needed tallow. Philosophy needed paper, and paper needed rags, mills, printers, carriers, sellers, and hands to unfold it. Conversation needed coffee, and coffee needed empire ships, roasting, boiling, serving, and cleaning. The mind may have wanted to rise above the body, but the body kept ordering another dish. The smell of coffee is everywhere, though not always in the way a modern person expects. We have trained ourselves to think of coffee as fragrant in a clean, controlled, almost comforting way. Fresh beans, measured water, clean machines, the small domestic theatre of brewing. The coffeehouse coffee of the 18th century could be harsher. Beans might be roasted unevenly, sometimes too dark, sometimes not enough. The drink was often boiled rather than brewed by methods we would recognise today as careful. Grounds could settle thickly at the bottom. The taste might be bitter, muddy, and strong enough to make a man feel improved even if he did not enjoy it. But enjoyment was not the only point. Coffee had a reputation. It was a drink of alertness. It was associated with talk, business, reading, and sobriety. It promised that the mind could remain awake after the body had finished the day. That promise helped explain why men tolerated the taste. They were drinking not only coffee, but an idea about themselves. A tavern allowed a man to soften the edges of the world. A coffeehouse promised to sharpen them. This distinction was often exaggerated by coffee's defenders, and we should not accept it too innocently. Coffeehouse men could be vain, foolish, aggressive, credulous, and wrong with tremendous energy. Sobriety does not automatically produce wisdom. Still, there was a real difference between a room organised around ale and a room organised around coffee and newsprint. The coffeehouse encouraged a man to remain awake in public. That was its special offer. It did not make him better. It made him available to hear, answer, judge, boast, repeat, and be judged in turn. Tobacco makes the air heavier. Pipes are everywhere. A man draws on one while listening to the newspaper. Another uses the stem of his pipe to point at a paragraph as if the smoke has made him an authority. Clay pipes, long and fragile, break easily, and broken stems may end up on the floor among ash, mud, and bits of spilled paper. The smell of tobacco mixes with tallow, coffee, damp wool, sweat, ink, old wood, and the sour trace of the street. The modern mind might want to open a window immediately, but opening a window means losing heat, disturbing papers, inviting cold, and perhaps letting in the smells of the street, which are not exactly an improvement. So the room keeps breathing itself. Men cough and continue talking. They complain about the air and then light another pipe. No one seems to notice the contradiction, because people rarely notice contradictions that belong to their own habits. This is where the coffeehouse becomes difficult to romanticize too cleanly. It is lively, yes. Important, yes. Connected to the spread of ideas, news, commerce, and public opinion, yes. But it is also uncomfortable. Benches are hard. The floor is dirty. The light is poor. The coffee may be bad. The air is worse. The fire is too hot if you sit near it and too far away if you do not. Men interrupt. Men repeat themselves. Men who have heard half a fact speak as if they have swallowed the whole truth. Someone is always arriving with a rumour. Someone is always correcting the rumour with another rumour dressed as knowledge. The room is not a peaceful academy. It is a working public place, and public places are never as graceful as the ideals attached to them. Still, that discomfort is part of what makes it historically alive. The Enlightenment was not only a set of polished books, There was also a set of habits practiced under imperfect conditions. Men tried to argue while cold air came under the door. They tried to read by smoking candles. They tried to discuss reason while servants squeezed around them. They tried to form opinions in a room where the loudest voice could temporarily defeat the best evidence. And yet somehow, from places like this, a new kind of public life grew. Not because every argument was intelligent, but because argument itself became ordinary. Not because every man was learned, but because more men expected to hear and repeat things that had once been kept within narrower circles. That expectation changed the texture of urban life. Listen to the room for a moment. There is no single sound. The coffee house is made of overlapping layers, cups set down against wood, chairs scraping, the soft crackle of the fire, the clipped sound of snuffers against a candle wick, the wet cough of a pipe smoker, the rustle of newspaper, the slap of a hand on the table when a man decides emphasis has become necessary, a laugh from one corner, followed by a louder objection from another, the door latch, boots on the floor, a servant calling for room to pass, someone asking for the paper, someone else saying he is not finished with it, a reader beginning again from the top because half the table missed the sentence. It is not a roar exactly. It is a constant human pressure. A room full of men trying to be heard without admitting how much they want to be heard. Argument has its own music, but not in a poetic sense. It has timing. One man begins with a statement, another interrupts before the statement is complete because he recognizes the shape of it and dislikes where it is going. A third tries to mediate, which often means making both sides angrier. A fourth asks for evidence, not always because he values evidence, but because demanding it is a useful way to slow an opponent. Someone cites a newspaper. Someone dismisses the newspaper. Someone claims to have a private letter. That changes the room because private letters carry a special weight. A printed report is available to all. A private letter suggests access. A man who can say, "I had it from a correspondent," has given himself a small platform. Whether the correspondent exists, whether he is reliable, whether the letter says exactly what is claimed, these are separate questions, and they may not be answered before the argument moves on. This is where coffeehouse conversation becomes a kind of performance. The men are not only exchanging information, they are displaying judgment. They are showing how quickly they can connect a report from abroad to a price at home, a minister's speech to a likely policy, a pamphlet to a faction, a scientific discovery to an old religious concern. The quickness matters. A slow man may be thoughtful in private, but in a coffeehouse he risks being trampled by the pace. A man who speaks too quickly risks saying something foolish. The best performers in the room know how to pause just long enough to make others wait. They let the silence gather around them, then deliver a sentence cleanly. The room rewards that. Not with applause, usually, but with attention, and attention is one of the most desired currencies in any public place. There are rules beneath the noise. Men can mock one another, but the mockery has to remain within a range the room accepts. They can disagree, but a certain level of manners is expected if the coffeehouse has pretensions to polite society. The 18th century cared about politeness, not as simple kindness, but as a code of controlled public behaviour. A man who could dispute without seeming coarse displayed social training. A man who lost his temper too visibly risked looking low even if he was right. This did not prevent anger. It shaped how anger was expressed. A cold insult could be better than a shout. A raised eyebrow could do what a fist would do in a rougher room. The coffeehouse was not always peaceful, but many of its customers wanted their conflicts to look like reason rather than brawling. That desire itself tells us something about the age. And yet the room always has the possibility of tipping. Too much politics, too much faction, too much wounded pride, too much suspicion that a man has been insulted in front of people whose opinion matters, and the Polish cracks. Voices rise, a table is struck harder, someone stands. Others turn to watch, which is usually the worst thing a crowd can do for men trying to remain sensible. The coffeehouse keeper may intervene, not from philosophical commitment to moderation, but because broken furniture and frightened customers are bad for trade. The servants know which arguments are ordinary and which ones might become trouble. Regulars know too. A man who has been in the room for years can hear danger before a newcomer can see it. Certain names do that, certain subjects, religion, succession, war, taxes, the liberty of the press, the corruption of ministers, the rights of colonies, the power of mobs. The wrong sentence in the wrong room can make the air change. This is one reason spies and informers fit so naturally into coffeehouse history. They did not need disguises worthy of the theatre. They needed patience, ears, and the ability to look like men who had nothing better to do than sit in a coffeehouse. In a world where political talk moved through public rooms became useful to those who wished to monitor it. This does not mean every man in the corner was an agent. Suspicion is easy to exaggerate. But the possibility mattered. Men knew that speech in public was not the same as speech at home. They also knew that the excitement of the room could make caution feel dull. A man might begin carefully, and, after an hour of agreement from others, say more than he planned. Coffee sharpened the mind, but it did not always sharpen prudence. The argument tonight may begin with something printed. Perhaps a newspaper report from the continent. Perhaps a pamphlet criticising a minister. Perhaps a notice about a public lecture in natural philosophy. Perhaps an advertisement for a book promising to explain electricity to curious readers. The Age of Enlightenment had a hunger for explanation. It wanted systems, causes, laws, classifications, experiments, proofs, and principles. But inside the coffeehouse, that hunger often arrived in practical form. What does this discovery mean? Can it be trusted? Who performed the experiment? Was it witnessed? Does it support religion or threaten it? Is it useful for navigation, medicine, industry, war, or merely for amusing gentlemen who have more leisure than sense? The coffeehouse made abstract matters social by forcing them into ordinary speech. Imagine a discussion about electricity before electricity has become the domestic servant we know. Men have seen demonstrations or heard of them. Sparks drawn from machines, Leyden jars, public lectures where natural philosophers make invisible forces visible for paying audiences. Someone in the coffeehouse has attended one and describes it with pleasure, though he improves the details as he goes. Another man doubts the usefulness of such experiments. A third insists that all knowledge is useful because no man can know in advance what nature will yield. A clergyman, if present, may warn against pride while also being interested enough to ask a technical question. A merchant asks whether any of this can help ships. A wit says it may at least help shock dull men awake. The room laughs, and the subject moves on before anyone has fully understood it. This too is how ideas spread. Not always deeply, not always accurately, but widely enough that curiosity becomes fashionable. The coffee house is good at making curiosity respectable. That may be one of its quiet achievements. To ask about the world in public, to want the latest report, to discuss experiments, voyages, books, laws and foreign events, to have an opinion on matters beyond one's household or trade, these habits made a man seem engaged with the age. Of course, there were limits. Too much curiosity about the wrong subject could be dangerous. Too much confidence could become ridiculous. But a certain alertness was admired. The coffeehouse rewarded men who could keep up. It also punished those who could not by leaving them silent on the bench while the room moved without them. There is a young man near the edge of the room who has not spoken much. He may be the apprentice we imagined earlier, or a clerk or a student passing through London with more ambition than money. He has paid his penny and is now receiving an education in the most uneven way possible. He learns that the printed word is powerful but not final. He learns that older men often speak with certainty because certainty itself gives them standing. He learns that humour can rescue a weak argument if the room wants to laugh. He learns that names matter. Newton, Locke, Swift, Addison, Walpole, Voltaire, depending on the year and place. are not merely writers or thinkers, but social signals. To know them is to show membership in a wider conversation. To mispronounce them, misunderstand them, or praise the wrong thing about them may expose him. So he listens. Listening is an underrated historical act. We remember speakers because their words survive more easily. We remember writers because paper preserves them. But rooms like this were built by listeners as much as talkers. A man listening carefully could carry an argument elsewhere. He could take it to another coffeehouse, a workshop, a shop counter, a dinner table, a correspondence, a pamphlet, a political meeting, or a tavern. The listener is the bridge between rooms. He may not create the thought, but he moves it. The coffeehouse depends on such men. Not everyone can dominate the table. Someone must absorb, repeat, adjust, and circulate. In the 18th century, when news moved through print but also through faces and voices, listening was part of the machinery of public life. The servant has heard everything and nothing. That is another part of the room we should not miss. He moves through these conversations constantly, close enough to catch every dangerous phrase and socially distant enough that many customers forget he has ears. He hears merchants lie politely. He hears politicians praised by men who mocked them last week. He hears writers fishing for compliments. He hears men speak of liberty while snapping their fingers for service. He hears the same arguments return in new clothes. His knowledge of the room may be deeper than that of the customers, but it is not the kind of knowledge the room agrees to honour. The Enlightenment spoke often of mankind, reason, improvement and liberty, but the people carrying dishes through the smoke were not usually the ones invited to define those terms. That contradiction is not an interruption of the story. It is part of the story. The coffeehouse helped form modern public culture, but it did so within societies built on hierarchy, exclusion, empire and labour that many of the men inside preferred not to examine too closely. The coffee in the dish had travelled through global systems of trade. The sugar some men stirred into it was tied to plantation slavery. The tobacco filling the air came through Atlantic commerce. The newspapers discussed liberty while advertising runaway servants, enslaved people, goods from colonies, and the machinery of an expanding imperial world. A coffeehouse could be a place of reason and a place of blindness at the same time. That is not a reason to dismiss it. It is a reason to look at it honestly. The room grows louder as the evening deepens. Men who arrived cold are now warm enough to become bold. The first dish of coffee has become a second for some. Others have shifted to conversation so completely that the drink is forgotten. A pipe is relit from a candle. Someone curses softly when ash falls on a newspaper. A man near the window wipes condensation from the glass and sees mostly his own reflection, pale and distorted by the interior light. Outside, the city is dark except for lamps, windows, and the movement of people who still have work to do. Inside, the coffeehouse feels almost sealed off, not safe exactly, but enclosed. It has become its own weather. Argument in such a room is physical. Men lean forward. They turn their shoulders away from one speaker and toward another. They lower their voices when the subject requires seriousness, then raise them again when they want witnesses. They use their hands. They tap the table. They hold a paper close to a candle and risk scorching it. They point with pipes, spoons, folded pamphlets, fingers stained with ink or tobacco. Their bodies show belief before their sentences finish. A man who disagrees may smile too early. A man who is losing may drink to avoid answering. A man who has won a point may pretend indifference and fail completely. All of this is part of the conversation. The spoken argument is only the visible portion. Beneath it run status, rivalry, memory, debt, friendship, faction, ambition, insecurity, and the simple human desire not to look foolish in front of others. That desire shapes knowledge more than philosophers like to admit. In a coffeehouse, a man may change his opinion because evidence persuades him. He may also change it because the room has turned and he does not want to be left alone on the wrong side. He may repeat an argument not because he believes it deeply, but because it worked well when another man used it. He may dismiss a report because a rival introduced it. He may embrace a theory because a respected regular nodded while it was explained. Public reason is never pure. It passes through human beings, and human beings bring vanity, fear, loyalty, impatience, and appetite with them. The coffeehouse did not remove these things. It put them at the same table as newspapers and called the result discussion. And yet, out of that imperfect discussion came real habits of criticism. Men learned to ask where news came from. They learned to compare reports. They learned to distrust official statements when unofficial information contradicted them. They learned to value witnesses, letters, dates, ships, signatures, editions, and the reputation of printers. They learned that a claim could be challenged publicly. This was not universal and not always fair, but it mattered. A society in which more claims are challenged aloud is not automatically wise, but it is different from one in which most people receive authority in silence. The coffeehouse helped normalise the challenge. That may be one of the reasons authorities found it both useful and irritating. There is a practical side to the sound of argument too. It brings customers. A dead room is bad for business. A lively argument suggests that something is happening, and people like to be near happenings. The keeper may pretend annoyance, but a good dispute that does not break furniture is good trade. Men linger. They order again. They tell others. There was a fine argument last night, one might say, and that sentence alone can fill benches the next evening. The coffeehouse sells participation, but it also sells spectatorship. Not every man wants to fight with words. Some want to watch others do it. There is pleasure in seeing a pompous man humbled, a clever man cornered, a quiet man suddenly reveal himself, a rumour exposed, a joke land perfectly. The room is theatre without a stage. Now look again at the candles. They are lower than when the man entered. The flames have been corrected several times, but wax and tallow still obey their own arithmetic. Light is being spent. This is easy to forget in a public room because the individual customer is not the one counting candles. At home, a family might think carefully before lighting another. In the coffee house, light is part of the price. The customer has rented a share of it. That changes his evening. He can read longer than he might in his lodging. He can sit in company without supplying the fire. He can occupy light that someone else manages. The penny again buys more than coffee. It buys a small escape from the private economy of darkness. For men living in cramped rooms, apprenticeships, lodgings or households where quiet reading was difficult, this mattered. The coffeehouse offered a shared interior after dark, a place not quite home and not quite work, a place where one could remain visible. That visibility had value. To be seen regularly in the right coffeehouse could help establish a man's identity. He became associated with a circle, a trade, a political tendency, a literary set, a level of seriousness. Absence might be noticed. A rival might be noticed. A newcomer could slowly become a familiar face, then a voice, then perhaps a man whose opinion was requested. This is how belonging forms in public, not all at once, but through repeated evenings in the same air. The sound of argument changes once a man belongs. At first, it surrounds him. Later, it includes him. That transition may be one of the most powerful attractions the coffeehouse offered. The young listener who sits quietly tonight may answer a question next month. In a year, he may bring news of his own. In 5 years, he may be the man whose private letter makes the room turn. The coffeehouse allowed a certain kind of social climbing through information, wit, and regular presence. It did not overthrow hierarchy, but it gave ambitious men another ladder to attempt. Some slipped, some climbed, some only convinced themselves they were climbing, which is a common enough human outcome. By late evening, the room has taken on a settled disorder. The first rush of arrivals has passed. The men who remain are those who wanted more than a quick report. Papers lie in several states of exhaustion. Some are folded neatly by careful hands, others bent, stained, and softened by use. The fire has sunk and been stirred back up. The candles make small halos in the smoke. The coffee has been poured so often that the smell seems built into the walls. A debate that began with foreign policy has somehow become an argument about human nature. No one remembers the exact turn, and no one admits to losing the thread. Someone has quoted a line from a poem. Someone else has said poetry is a distraction from business. A third man has replied that business without poetry is merely accounting, which earns either laughter or contempt depending on the room. The Enlightenment inside the coffee house often looked like this: intelligent, vain, restless, practical, curious, impatient, sociable, exclusionary, generous in one breath and blind in the next. It was not a clean march from ignorance to reason. It was a crowded evening full of men trying to make sense of a world that was expanding faster than their inherited categories could comfortably hold. New sciences unsettled old explanations. New markets connected distant lives. New papers multiplied opinions. New habits of sociability made private judgment more public. The coffee house did not solve the confusion. It gave confusion a table, a candle, a dish of coffee, and an audience. And somewhere in the middle of that room, the man who paid his penny has begun to understand why the place matters. Not because every sentence is wise. Many are not. Not because every person is equal. They are not. Not because the coffee is good. It may not be. The room matters because it gathers the materials of an age and makes them audible. Candlelight, smoke, coffee, paper, trade, empire, science, gossip, ambition, class, wit, fear, curiosity and argument, all pressed together until the evening feels larger than the room that holds it. A man enters from the street carrying one life and finds, for a few hours, that many other lives have become available through talk. The candles continue to burn. The smoke continues to gather. The coffee cools and is replaced. The argument folds into another argument, as it always does. Then someone near the door calls attention to a fresh paper, or a letter newly arrived, or a report from another house where the news has already begun to move. The room shifts toward it with the instinct of men who have trained themselves to follow information, the way others follow a bell. The sound changes, benches creak. Conversations break off halfway. A newspaper is lifted into the best available light, and suddenly all that smoke and heat and talk has a new centre. The evening has been waiting for this without admitting it, because in the coffee house, no object commanded attention quite like paper carrying news from the world beyond the door. The newspaper is lifted into the best available light, and the whole room adjusts itself around it. That is one of the small movements that tells you what kind of place this is. Men who were speaking a moment earlier now stop in the middle of a sentence. A pipe is held away from the page so ash will not fall on the print. Someone leans closer without asking permission. Someone else complains that the reader is blocking the candle. The paper itself is not large by modern standards, and it is not fresh in the way we use that word now, where news arrives so quickly that a thing can feel old before the hour is over. But in this room, at this table, under this wavering light, the sheet has authority. It has come from elsewhere. It has been printed, carried, purchased, unfolded, and placed before men who are waiting to turn distant events into local conversation. That is the first thing to understand about newspapers in the coffee house. They did not sit quietly. They did not wait politely to be read in private. They became social objects the moment they touched the table. A newspaper in a modern home can be folded beside a breakfast plate, ignored, skimmed, or thrown away. A newspaper in an 18th century coffee house has a public life. It travels from hand to hand. It gathers fingerprints, stains, objections, corrections, and authority it may not deserve. One man reads aloud because not everyone can see it. Another interrupts because he thinks the reader has misread a line. A third asks whether the printer is known to favour the ministry or the opposition. Someone at the back asks for the shipping notices. Someone near the fire wants Parliament. Someone else does not care about either one until he hears a familiar name and suddenly cares very much. The paper is no longer merely printed matter. It has become the evening's table. It is easy to underestimate how important that shared reading was. We live in a world where most people carry private access to information in their pockets. You can read alone in bed, alone on a train, alone in a shop queue, alone at a table while someone across from you is also alone inside the same room. The 18th century coffeehouse worked differently. Reading there was often a communal act. The page entered the room and was converted into sound. That sound was then converted into argument. The argument was then converted into rumour, judgment, jokes, warnings, and sometimes decisions involving money. A paragraph about a fleet might affect a merchant's behaviour the next morning. A report from Parliament might become the basis of an argument in another coffeehouse before noon. A notice of a new book might send a young writer to a bookseller. A report of unrest abroad might confirm what one faction already believed and frighten another into saying that the report was certainly exaggerated. The paper was not the end of the news. It was the beginning of its social life. In the early 18th century, newspapers were not yet the massive daily institutions they would become later, but they were already changing the rhythm of public life. The Daily Courant, first published in London in 1702, is usually remembered as England's first daily newspaper. That detail matters because daily news changes expectation. A weekly paper belongs to a slower world. A daily paper trains readers to expect movement. It teaches them that the world may have altered since yesterday. It makes waiting for the next sheet part of the day's routine. In a coffeehouse where papers were read aloud and discussed collectively, that expectation became social. Men did not only want to know what had happened, they wanted to know whether others had already heard it, what those others thought, and whether a report had changed the balance of conversation since the previous evening. The printed page carried many kinds of information side by side, and that mixture gave the coffeehouse much of its texture. Political reports sat near commercial notices. Foreign news appeared beside advertisements for medicines, books, auctions, runaway apprentices, lost watches, lectures, imported goods, estate sales, theatrical performances, and ships preparing to sail. This can seem messy to a modern reader, but the mess is revealing. The newspaper did not divide life into clean categories. It placed the world's anxieties and appetites in columns. A man could read about war on the continent, then glance down and see an advertisement for a new translation of a French philosophical work, a notice for a public demonstration of electricity, a reward for the return of stolen cloth, or a bookseller offering a controversial pamphlet. This was not a separate culture of politics, commerce, science, and everyday life. It was all on the same paper, and in the coffeehouse it was all available for talk. The official newspaper of government, the London Gazette, had a different tone from the livelier papers and pamphlets that men often preferred to argue over. The Gazette carried official notices, appointments, military reports, proclamations, and controlled information. It mattered, because it spoke with the voice of authority, or at least close to it. But authority was not always the same as excitement. A coffeehouse crowd might want the Gazette because it provided facts that could be cited, but men also wanted the papers that hinted, mocked, attacked, speculated, and arranged the same public world into sharper shapes. An official report might say a battle had been conducted with honour. A less friendly account might ask why so many ships had been lost. A government notice might announce a policy. A pamphlet might call it ruinous. The coffeehouse lived in the space between these voices. It gave men a place to compare them, distrust them, exaggerate them, and decide which version made them sound most informed. Pamphlets deserve their own place on the table because they were one of the great weapons of the period. They could be written quickly, printed quickly, sold cheaply enough to move, and argued over before a slower book had even found its readers. A pamphlet might defend a ministry, attack a bishop, expose a scandal, ridicule a poet, explain a scientific discovery, dispute a sermon, warn of national decline, or promise that all would be well if only a certain group of fools stopped ruining the country. That last category has remained popular in every century. In the coffeehouse, a pamphlet did not need to be read by everyone to influence everyone. One man could summarise it with confidence. Another could respond to the summary without having read the original. A third could repeat the response elsewhere as if he had followed the whole exchange. This is how print multiplied itself through talk. The pamphlet had one physical body, but the argument it carried could leave the room in several altered forms. There is a habit we should notice here because it feels very modern. Men often reacted not only to what had been written, but to who had printed it, who was rumoured to have written it, who was seen reading it, who praised it, and who condemned it. Reputation clung to paper. A bookseller's shop could have a political association. A printer could be suspected of serving a faction. An anonymous pamphlet might become more interesting precisely because it was anonymous. Who wrote it? A minister? A dismissed clerk? A churchman hiding behind initials? A disappointed office seeker? A wit from one of the literary coffeehouses? Anonymity did not stop interpretation. It invited more of it. The coffeehouse was very good at supplying motives where facts were missing. Now imagine a particular sheet being opened. The print is dense. There is no photograph to guide the eye, no large headline in the modern sense shouting the emotional meaning of the page before anyone has read a sentence. The reader has to work through columns. The men around him have to listen with patience, though patience in a coffeehouse is rarely complete. He begins with foreign news. The item may have arrived from Amsterdam, Paris, Vienna, Lisbon, or some other centre in the chain of European information. Amsterdam was especially important as a place where news, finance, publishing and international exchange met. Reports from continental Europe often passed through several hands before appearing in London. By the time they reached the coffeehouse, they had travelled across borders, languages, ships, roads, printers, translators, editors and private correspondents. Each stage could sharpen the report, dull it, delay it or distort it. The men in the room know this, but they still lean closer. This is one of the quiet tensions of the evening. Everyone knows news can be wrong, but everyone needs it before it is fully secure. A merchant cannot always wait for perfect confirmation. A political man cannot wait until every report is official. A writer cannot wait until a subject has cooled. The coffeehouse exists partly because uncertainty itself has value. The first man to hear may be the first man to act. A rumour of war can matter before war is declared. A rumour of peace can move prices before treaties are signed. A rumour of a ship lost can ruin one man and enrich another, depending on what he ensured and what he believed. So the room does not simply ask, is this true? It asks, who believes it? Who benefits if it is believed? How many have heard it? Where did it come from? Is there another report? Has Lloyd's heard the same? Was it in the Gazette? Did the Dutch papers print it? Did a captain say it? Did a clerk at the Admiralty whisper it? Did a man in another coffeehouse swear he saw the letter? Truth moves slowly. Consequence moves faster. The words, "I have it from a letter," could change the atmosphere at a table. Private correspondence had a status that printed reports did not always possess. A letter suggested access, and access was one of the currencies of coffeehouse life. A merchant with letters from abroad might be treated with special attention. A traveller newly arrived could become valuable for an evening simply because he had seen a place others were discussing. A clerk who knew someone in an office could make himself important by hinting at what had not yet been printed. The coffeehouse rewarded proximity, and sometimes proximity could be performed even when it was thin. A man did not have to lie directly. He could say, "There are people who believe," or "It is said in certain circles," or "I would not put too much weight on it, but..." These phrases have survived because they are useful. They allow rumour to enter the room wearing a modest coat. The rumour then begins to change shape. It arrives as one thing and leaves as another. A ship is delayed becomes a ship is feared lost. A minister is ill becomes the government may fall. A writer is preparing a reply becomes the pamphlet has already been printed. A foreign prince has moved, troops becomes war is certain. A bank is cautious becomes credit is failing. The movement from fact to conclusion is not always dishonest. Often it's simply human. People turn fragments into stories because fragments are difficult to hold. A story has direction. It tells the mind what to feel. The coffee house is full of men doing that work aloud, shaping uncertainty into something repeatable. There are men in the room who pride themselves on not being fooled. They're often fooled in a different style. One dismisses every rumour until he misses the one that proves true. Another believes only commercial intelligence and therefore underestimates politics. A third trusts letters more than newspapers, forgetting that letters are written by men with interests of their own. A fourth trusts nothing unless he heard it from a regular at a particular house, which is merely superstition in a better coat. The Enlightenment prized scepticism, and rightly so, but scepticism in practice is difficult. Doubt can become wisdom. It can also become vanity. A man may reject a true report because accepting it would require him to admit that someone he dislikes knew it first. The coffee house is a school of reason, but it is also a school of pride. Advertisements bring a different kind of life to the table. They may seem less grand than politics and philosophy, but they show the city in a way official news cannot. A notice for a runaway apprentice tells you about labour, discipline, youth, escape, and authority. A reward for a stolen horse tells you about mobility and value. An advertisement for a lecture in astronomy or electricity tells you about curiosity becoming entertainment. A bookseller's notice tells you what arguments are being marketed. A medicine advertisement tells you about illness, fear, and hope. A sale of imported goods tells you about empire sitting quietly in daily consumption. A notice for a theatrical performance tells you where certain kinds of people may gather later that week. In the coffee house, even advertisements could become conversation. Men laughed at extravagant claims. They marked auctions. They looked for opportunities. They noticed names. The newspaper was a map of appetite. The coffeehouse table may hold several printed forms at once: newspapers, pamphlets, handbills, broadsides, price lists, shipping lists, auction notices, periodicals with essays on manners and morals. A copy of The Spectator might be lying near a commercial paper, and that physical closeness matters. The Spectator, published in the early 18th century, presented moral essays, social observations, literary commentary, and reflections on polite life in a style meant for the expanding reading public. Men read such essays not only for information but for self-fashioning. They learned how a reasonable man might think, speak, judge, laugh, and criticise. A coffeehouse reader could absorb not just facts but manners. Print taught him subjects. It also taught him tone. This is where newspapers and coffeehouse conversation begin to shape one another deeply. Papers did not simply report the world to a waiting public. They helped create the public that read them. A man who read regularly learned to expect continuity. Yesterday's report would be followed by today's development. A minister criticised in one issue might be defended in another. A letter to the editor might answer a previous claim. Public debate gained sequence. Men could follow a controversy across days or weeks. Coffee houses intensified that sequence because customers returned and carried memory with them. Last Tuesday you said the ministry would never allow it, one man might say. Now look. Public reading created public accountability, though not always fairly. A man could be trapped by his own earlier confidence, which is one of the risks of speaking regularly in any age. There is something almost physical about the way news sits in the room. It is on the table, but it is also in the air. The printed sheet gives one version. The men supply others. A late arrival brings what he heard at another coffee house. Someone from the river brings a report from the docks. A bookseller's assistant has heard that a certain pamphlet is selling fast. A lawyer has seen someone connected to a case. A gentleman claims to know what was said in a private dinner. A foreign visitor adds a detail about Paris that may be true. or may simply confirm what the English already enjoy believing about the French. Each contribution floats above the paper and mingles with it. The newspaper is no longer alone. Rumour has entered. Rumour is often treated as the enemy of news, but in 18th century coffeehouse life the two were closely linked. Printed news was often delayed, incomplete, cautious, censored, partisan, or dependent on uncertain reports itself. Rumour filled gaps. It moved ahead of print. It tested possibilities. It gave men something to do while waiting for confirmation. This made it dangerous, but also useful. A rumour could warn. It could mislead. It could reveal anxiety. It could expose what people wanted to believe. The fact that a rumour spread quickly did not prove it true, but it proved that it touched something already present in the room. Fear of war, distrust of government, hope for profit, suspicion of foreigners, admiration for science, hatred of taxes, desire for scandal. Rumour moved along the grooves that society had already worn for it. A coffeehouse regular learned to read rumour as carefully as print. Not only what is being said, but who is saying it, who is silent, who looks pleased, who looks alarmed, who leaves early, who asks for a private word, who pretends not to care. The room itself becomes a text. The man who understands this has an advantage. He knows that information is never only in sentences, it is in timing. If a merchant hears a report and immediately sends a messenger, that matters. If a political man laughs too loudly at a rumour damaging to his own side, that matters. If a usually talkative regular says nothing when a certain subject appears, that matters. The coffeehouse teaches men to notice behaviour as evidence. This attention could make the room feel charged. Every arrival might carry news. Every folded paper might contain something important. Every conversation at a nearby table might be worth overhearing. The desire to overhear is one of the defining pleasures of the coffeehouse. Men did not come only to speak with their own companions. They came to be surrounded by talk that might suddenly become useful. A stranger's careless sentence could open a door. A joke might reveal a political leaning. A complaint might expose a commercial problem. A whispered name might be worth remembering. The coffeehouse rewarded loose attention, the ability to seem engaged in one conversation while listening to another. This is not noble exactly, but it is very human. There is a young man near the table tonight who is learning this skill. He has not yet developed the relaxed look of a true regular. He turns his head too quickly when something interests him. He gives himself away by listening too obviously. Older men notice and perhaps enjoy it. They were young once, though most have edited the memory. He watches how the newspaper moves. He sees that certain men are allowed to hold it longer. He notices that a commercial notice can matter more to the room than a speech in Parliament if the right people are present. He learns that not all printed words have equal weight. A paragraph from an official source may be treated with suspicion. A private letter may be treated as gold. An advertisement may be laughed at and then quietly copied down. A rumour may be publicly dismissed and privately acted upon. He's beginning to understand that knowledge in this room is not a simple ladder from ignorance to truth. It is a market. Markets require trust and distrust at the same time. Too much trust and you are cheated. Too much distrust and you cannot trade. The coffeehouse operates on the same principle. Men must believe enough to keep talking and doubt enough to keep testing. This balance is unstable. It shifts by topic and by mood. When the room wants excitement, doubt weakens. When a man they dislike brings news, doubt strengthens. When money is involved, men demand better sources, though not always before acting. When politics is involved, evidence often bends toward faction. This does not make the room useless. It makes it recognisable. Public conversation has always been shaped by the imperfect character of the public. The papers also created a shared calendar of attention. Certain days mattered because certain publications appeared. Mail days mattered because letters arrived. Parliamentary sessions mattered because reports followed. Ship arrivals mattered because colonial and foreign news came with them. The coffeehouse evening was tied to these rhythms. Men knew when to expect information. They knew when a room would be busy, when a particular table would fill, when a printer's boy might arrive, when foreign mail could change the conversation. This rhythm gave urban life a pulse beyond sunrise and sunset. News time became part of social time. Consider how different that is from a rural household where evening turns inward around fire, food, and family work. The coffeehouse evening turns outward. The room is physically enclosed, but mentally it reaches in every direction. To the docks, to Parliament, to Paris, to Amsterdam, to Jamaica, to Bengal, to Boston, to battlefields, to stock markets, to bookshops, to lecture rooms, to courts, to royal palaces, to prisons. A man sits in one smoky room and feels connected to many distant places, though his knowledge of them may be fragmentary and self-serving. That feeling of connection is one of the foundations of modern public life. It is also one of its illusions. Knowing that a place has appeared in the news is not the same as understanding it. The coffee house often confused the two, as we still do. The colonial world entered these rooms constantly, though not always with moral clarity. Reports from the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa and Asia appeared as trade, war, commodities, settlements, naval movements, prices, conflicts and opportunities. Coffee itself, sugar, tobacco, tea, chocolate, cotton, indigo, and other goods tied the evening table to global systems of labour and empire. Men could discuss liberty while consuming products shaped by unfree labour. They could condemn tyranny in Europe while ignoring or defending domination overseas. Newspapers sometimes made these contradictions visible, but visibility does not guarantee reckoning. The coffee house was a place where the modern world spoke about itself, and like the modern world, it often spoke around its own foundations. Still, the printed page could also disturb comfortable assumptions. Reports of distant events gave readers material for comparison. Accounts of different governments, customs, economies, religions, and scientific findings widened the range of what could be imagined. Enlightenment thought depended partly on comparison. How do other societies govern? What is natural and what is merely customary? Are laws universal or local? Are manners signs of refinement or masks for interest? Coffeehouse readers did not all ask these questions in a disciplined way, but the material for such questions lay before them. A notice from abroad might become a philosophical argument in the hands of the right speaker, or a prejudice in the hands of another. The paper did not decide. The room did. Now the reader reaches a domestic political item, and the room sharpens. Foreign news can be exciting, but domestic politics touches pride more directly. Men know the names, they know the factions, they know which papers lean which way. They have grievances ready. A sentence about a tax draws a groan from one table. A mention of a minister produces a joke already used twice this week, and still considered acceptable. Someone says the report is planted. Someone asks whether he has proof. He says proof is not needed when the pattern is clear. Another man says that is exactly what fools say when they have no proof. A laugh moves across the room. The reader has lost control of the paper for the moment because the printed item has done its work. It has released the argument. This is one reason coffeehouse keepers had to manage the room carefully. Political talk brought energy, and energy brought customers, but too much could make the house known as troublesome. The authorities had long been anxious about coffeehouse discussion, and the memory of attempts to regulate or suppress them did not disappear. Even when no immediate danger existed, the possibility of being overheard shaped speech. Some men enjoyed that possibility. It made them feel brave. Others lowered their voices at certain names. A few spoke in hints, so they could later deny meaning what everyone understood. Rumour and politics thrive in such half-speech. It allows men to share danger without taking full responsibility for it. The newspaper returns to the table, but now it is marked by the room. A fold has torn slightly. A corner is damp. Someone has drawn a finger under a line. A drop of coffee has touched the margin. This is not mistreatment. It is use. The paper's value is being spent. It may be read again later by another customer, but it will never be quite the same object it was when first unfolded. The room has entered it physically. By the end of the evening it may look exhausted. That exhaustion is a record of attention. A man near the window asks for the advertisements, and someone laughs as if advertisements are beneath serious men. But the laughter does not stop people from listening. A new book is announced. The title is long because 18th century titles often worked hard for their living. It promises an inquiry, a defence, a modest proposal, a true account, a letter to a gentleman, remarks upon remarks, or a complete refutation of errors recently published. The room enjoys titles that sound like arguments before the first page has begun. Someone says he knows the author. Someone else says no one knows the author, which is the point. A third says he read a better answer last week. The young listener stores the title carefully. He may not buy it, but he wants to recognise it if it appears again. Recognition is part of belonging. A notice for a scientific lecture draws another kind of interest. Public lectures in natural philosophy became popular in the 18th century, and demonstrations could attract audiences beyond formal universities. Electricity, astronomy, mechanics, optics, air pumps, magnets, and other subjects were made visible through instruments and performance. The coffeehouse was an ideal place for such notices to circulate because it gathered exactly the sort of men who wished to be curious in public. Some were genuinely hungry for knowledge. Some wanted to be seen as hungry for knowledge. The difference can be hard to distinguish, and perhaps it does not always matter. Fashion can carry ideas farther than sincerity alone. Then comes a report of crime, and the room takes it differently. Crime news has always held public attention because it allows people to feel fear, judgment, and superiority at once. A robbery on a road, a fraud, a forgery, a murder, a notorious trial, an execution at Tyburn, all could become coffeehouse talk. Men discuss guilt, punishment, the incompetence of watchmen, the decline of morals, the cleverness of criminals, the severity of law, and whether the condemned showed proper repentance. The same men who spoke grandly of reason a moment ago may now enjoy the details with unsettling appetite. This too belongs in the room. Enlightenment culture did not replace older pleasures in scandal, punishment, and moral spectacle. It sat beside them, sometimes in the same column. As the evening continues, the difference between newspaper and rumour becomes harder to hold. A printed item prompts a memory. The memory prompts a story. The story attracts correction. The correction introduces a private letter. The private letter is challenged by a man who heard otherwise at another house. Someone says the Dutch papers disagree. Someone else asks whether the Dutch papers are reliable on English matters. A man who knows no Dutch at all comments on the tone of Dutch reporting. The room accepts this more easily than it should. Then a late arrival enters, cold from the street, and brings news that may have been old elsewhere but is new here. The paper on the table is suddenly not enough. The living report has arrived. You can feel the shift. Printed news has authority, but living news has presence. A man who has just come from the docks, the theatre, the court, the bookseller, Parliament's neighbourhood, or another coffeehouse carries the energy of movement. He has been somewhere. He has seen faces. He has heard voices. The room wants him to speak before he has fully warmed himself. He may enjoy making them wait. He removes gloves slowly. He calls for coffee. He says it may be nothing. No phrase is better designed to make men listen. Then he begins, and the newspaper is no longer the centre. The rumour is, this is how the air fills, not only with smoke and heat, but with unfinished knowledge. The coffeehouse is crowded with things not yet confirmed. Men breathe them in, they carry them out. The city wakes the next morning with some of those rumours lodged in shops, counting houses, offices, markets, and homes. A sentence born near a coffeehouse table may travel farther than the man who spoke it. That is what makes the place powerful and dangerous. It is not only a room where news is consumed, it is a room where news is altered and released. The man who paid his penny has now heard enough to feel both informed and unsettled. He knows more than he did when he entered, but he is less sure what to trust. That is not a failure of the coffee house. It may be one of its most honest lessons. The wider world is not made simple by entering public conversation. It becomes more complicated. More sources, more voices, more motives, more chances to be wrong, more chances to recognise that others may know something you do not. The coffee house trains him in that discomfort. It teaches him to live among competing claims, to judge without certainty, to speak before everything is settled, and to be corrected in front of witnesses. These are not easy skills, but they are essential to the kind of society taking shape around him. The candles burn lower. The reader's voice grows rough. The paper is passed again. Someone asks for a specific notice and is told to wait. A man copies a name onto a scrap. Another folds his arms and declares the whole thing nonsense, though he remains close enough to hear the next line. Near the door, a newcomer is recognised and called over, because he may have heard more. The room rearranges itself around possibility. On the table lies the printed world. In the air moves the spoken one. Between them, the coffee house makes its evening trade, and as the papers continue to move from hand to hand, the men around them become more distinct. Not just customers now, not merely shapes in candle smoke, but types of people drawn to the same room for different reasons. The merchant listening for prices, the printer watching for appetite, the philosopher testing an idea on men who may not be patient with him, the clerk learning how public speech works, the wit waiting for a chance to wound elegantly, the government watcher saying little, the servant hearing everything. The coffee house is not one public, but many publics pressed together around tables too small for the weight of what is being carried on them, and to understand the room fully, we have to look at the people who filled it, who used it, who depended on it, and who made an evening of news and rumour feel like the centre of the modern world. The coffee house is not one public, but many publics pressed together around tables too small for the weight of what is being carried on them, and once you begin to look closely at the men inside, the room changes. It stops being only smoke, candlelight, coffee, and newsprint. It becomes a map of the 18th century city itself. Not the whole city, because no single room can hold everyone, and this room is already excluding more people than it admits. But among those who are allowed to cross the threshold, you can see different forms of power sitting near one another, sometimes speaking, sometimes listening, sometimes pretending not to listen. A merchant with shipping interests stands beside a printer who knows what people are willing to buy in scandal. A young clerk watches both of them, trying to learn what confidence looks like before he has earned any. A writer sits with one ear on the conversation and the other on his own reputation. A man who calls himself a philosopher may be present, though he may not use that word so easily. A government informer may be close enough to hear the careless sentence that will matter tomorrow. And moving between all of them is the servant, carrying dishes through the argument, hearing more than anyone gives him credit for, and belonging least to the world he keeps supplied. This is the part of the coffee house that is often flattened in memory. We talk about it as if the place were filled with philosophers, as if the benches were crowded every evening with men calmly discussing liberty, science, and the nature of human understanding. That did happen sometimes, or at least pieces of it did. But most coffee houses were not rooms full of famous thinkers waiting patiently to say quotable things. They were commercial rooms in commercial cities. Many of the men inside were there because money, information, and reputation moved through the place. The Enlightenment did not arrive only through pure curiosity. It also arrived through trade, ambition, competition, vanity, hunger for advantage, and the need to know things before other men knew them. If that sounds less noble, it is probably closer to life. Ideas often travel fastest when they're useful, profitable, fashionable, or dangerous. Start with the merchants, because in many coffee houses they are the most practical men in the room and among the most alert. A merchant in the 18th century lives by information, not information in the vague sense, but specific, timely, usable information. Which ship has arrived? Which ship has not? What cargo is damaged? Which ports are blocked? Whether war is likely? Whether peace is being negotiated? Whether sugar, coffee, tobacco, tea, indigo or grain will rise in price? Whether a debtor is reliable? Whether a captain is reckless? Whether an insurer is nervous? Whether a rumour has spread far enough to become a price? The merchant may not speak as loudly as the political talkers, but his listening can be more intense. He's not gathering opinions for amusement. He's weighing consequences. A careless report may cost him money. A good report may save it. The coffee house, for him, is not a pastime. It is part of the machinery of business. At Lloyd's, for example, the connection between coffeehouse life and maritime trade became especially clear. Men concerned with shipping gathered where shipping news gathered, and the room became useful because it concentrated a certain kind of knowledge. A merchant does not need every newspaper in London. He needs the right news from the right source at the right hour. He needs to know what the sea has done to other men's plans. The sea is present in that room, even though no wave touches the threshold. It is there in the names of ships, in the worried mention of storms, in insurance talk, in the silence that follows news of a vessel overdue. A ship at sea is an absence filled with calculation. Until it arrives, men argue around its possibility. The coffee house gives that uncertainty a table. These merchants are often practical skeptics. They may care little for a philosophical argument unless it touches trade, law, or policy. A new theory of government interests them if it suggests instability. A debate over empire interests them if it affects routes, tariffs, or markets. A war interests them not only as a matter of patriotism, but as a movement of risk and profit. This does not mean they are without principles. Some have strong political opinions, some support reform, some are deeply conservative, some are religious, some are cynical. But their habits of thought have been trained by ledgers and correspondence. They ask what follows from this, who pays, who gains, who is exposed, where is the proof, has anyone seen the letter, is the source reliable? The coffeehouse argument gains a hard edge when men like this enter it. They do not always admire elegance. They admire usable truth, or something close enough to truth to be acted upon before competitors move. Now look at the printers and booksellers, because they understand another kind of market. The merchant watches goods, ships, and credit. The printer watches appetite. He listens to the room and asks, sometimes silently, what will sell? Outrage sells, wit sells, scandal sells, religion sells, attacks sell, replies to attacks sell. A pamphlet can be made out of anger almost as quickly as anger can be made out of a pamphlet. The printer knows that public conversation is not only a symptom of print culture, it is raw material. A quarrel in a coffee house can become a publication. A rumour can become a notice. A speech can be excerpted. A sermon can be answered. A foolish public statement can be preserved in ink and made more permanent than the speaker intended. The printer moves between paper and talk with professional interest. He knows that what men argue about tonight may be what they will pay to read tomorrow. There is a practical skill in this. A printer must judge risk. Printing is not merely mechanical, it is political, commercial, and sometimes dangerous. Print the wrong thing too openly and trouble may come from authorities, from offended patrons, from rival printers, from mobs, or from the courts. Print too cautiously, and no one cares. The coffeehouse helps him measure the temperature of the public. Are men angry enough to buy a response? Are they tired of the subject? Is the ministry vulnerable? Is a certain author still fashionable? Has a joke already gone stale? Does a scandal have another week of life in it? The printer's ear is a tool. He listens not only for facts but for excitement. Excitement is inventory waiting to be set in type. A printer's boy may arrive with sheets under his arm, and for a moment he has more power than his station suggests. He is young, perhaps cold, perhaps ink-stained, perhaps treated sharply by men who depend on what he carries. He brings the room its fresh paper. He may know little of the argument the paper will cause, but he knows how men turn when he enters. The sheet is taken from him, unfolded, judged, handled, and turned into speech. He may be paid quickly and dismissed, or kept waiting while some customer complains that yesterday's paper was late or badly printed. The boy will go back out into the street and carry papers elsewhere. He is part of the circulation, though not honoured by it. History often remembers the essayist and forgets the boy who brought the essay into the room before the candles burned too low. The writer sits somewhere between printers and philosophers, though many would insist they are above both. Some coffeehouses became associated with literary life, and certain rooms gained reputations because known writers appeared there. Will's Coffeehouse had earlier been linked with John Dryden and literary conversation. Buttons became associated with Joseph Addison and his circle. These places were not merely where literature was discussed, they were where literary reputation was observed in public. A line could be praised, mocked, borrowed, or ruined by delivery. A young poet could watch older men and learn that wit was not only what appeared on the page, but how a man carried himself while saying it. A critic could injure a writer without writing a formal review. A rumour about authorship could travel faster than a book. The coffeehouse made literature social in a way that could be exhilarating or cruel, depending on where one stood in the joke. Do not picture the writer as always confident. Many are anxious. The coffeehouse feeds anxiety because it displays opinion before it is settled. A man who has published something may enter hoping to overhear praise, and find instead that his work has not been mentioned at all, which can be worse. Or he may hear it dismissed by someone who has clearly not read it, or praised for the wrong reason, or attributed to another man. He must decide whether to correct the room, endure it, or pretend indifference. Writers depend on public attention and resent the public for having opinions about them. This is not new. The coffeehouse gave that old tension chairs, candles and witnesses. The philosophers, or the men we later gather under that name, are more complicated. In the 18th century, the word philosopher did not always mean a professional academic. It could mean a natural philosopher interested in experiments, a moral philosopher concerned with human nature and society, a political thinker, a sceptical clergyman, a physician, a mathematician, a lecturer, or a well-read gentleman who wanted to be taken seriously. Some of the famous figures of the Enlightenment belonged more to salons, academies, correspondence networks, universities, clubs, and private libraries than to ordinary coffeehouse benches. But their ideas, their books, their reputations, and fragments of their arguments entered coffeehouses constantly. A man did not need to sit across from Locke to argue badly about Locke. He did not need Newton at the table to invoke Newton as proof that the age had become more rational. He did not need Voltaire present to repeat a sharp remark attributed to him with uncertain accuracy. Famous names moved through the room as social currency. This is important because the coffeehouse was often a place where difficult ideas were simplified, distorted, popularized, and made usable. That sounds like an insult, but it is also how ideas spread. A theory too technical to be understood by most readers might become a phrase. A philosophical argument might become a slogan. A scientific discovery might become a public lecture, then a newspaper notice, then a coffeehouse anecdote, then a joke, then a general belief that the world is more explainable than it used to be. The route from careful thought to common talk is never clean. Coffeehouses made it messy and alive. They lowered the temperature of abstraction by putting it into speech among people who wanted to know why it mattered. Imagine a man speaking about Newton. He has not read the Principia. Almost no one in the room has read it in a serious way. But he knows that Newton revealed laws in nature, that gravity can be spoken of as a force, that the heavens are not merely mysterious but mathematically ordered. He uses Newton's name to make a broader point. Another man uses the same name to make a different one. A clergyman insists that order in nature proves divine wisdom. A skeptic says that explanation removes superstition. A merchant wants to know whether any of this improves navigation. A wit says it has at least taught apples to fall with greater dignity. The room laughs, and Newton becomes part of public culture whether or not anyone has done justice to the mathematics. This is not the highest form of understanding, but it is still historically significant. A culture has changed when even incomplete knowledge of science becomes useful in conversation. The same happens with politics. A man may mention Locke and natural rights without following the full argument. Another may speak of liberty while meaning the liberty of men like himself. Another may condemn tyranny abroad and ignore domination at home. Someone may praise the Constitution without being able to explain its workings beyond inherited phrases. Someone else may attack corruption while hoping for an office. These contradictions fill the room, yet the language matters. Words like liberty, reason, improvement, property, commerce, virtue, corruption, toleration, nature, and rights become part of everyday public speech among men who may not agree on their meaning. The Coffeehouse gives those words circulation. Circulation does not guarantee clarity, but without circulation, words remain trapped in smaller worlds. The clerks are among the most interesting figures in the room because they are often close to power without possessing it. A clerk writes for merchants, lawyers, government offices, banks, insurers, printers, or courts. He copies, calculates, files, records, and carries words that may not belong to him. His work may be tedious, but it places him near documents. Documents are powerful in the 18th century. Letters, ledgers, contracts, bills, policies, petitions, minutes, court papers, shipping records, and lists of prices all shape the world. The clerk learns how power sounds when it becomes paper. In the coffeehouse, he may be quiet, but he is not empty. He has seen forms of information that louder men only discuss. A young clerk may come to the coffeehouse after hours because it offers him a second education. By day, he writes the words of other men. By evening, he hears men argue about the world those words control. He may not have the money or rank to dominate the room, but he can improve himself by listening. He learns which political phrases are fashionable. He learns how merchants speak when they are worried. He learns how lawyers avoid direct answers. He learns what newspapers matter, which printers are trusted, which coffeehouses have better information, and which men exaggerate by habit. He may one day use this knowledge. Even if he does not rise far, it changes his sense of himself. He's not merely copying the world, he is hearing it think aloud. This is why the coffeehouse could be dangerous to hierarchy even when it remained hierarchical. It trained observers. It allowed men below the highest ranks to hear how higher-ranking men explain themselves. It exposed the mechanisms of opinion. A clerk who hears a gentleman speak foolishly enough times may begin to question the natural superiority of gentlemen. An apprentice who hears merchants contradict one another may learn that confidence is not the same as truth. A printer's worker who hears politicians mocked may understand that authority can be made ridiculous. These are small shifts, but history is full of small shifts repeated until they become a change in posture. A man who has learned to judge in public is not the same as a man who only receives judgment. Of course, the coffeehouse did not welcome every clerk equally. Clothing, manners, money, confidence and connections shaped the experience. A poorly dressed young man might feel the room's judgment before anyone speaks. He may sit near the edge, where he can hear but not impose himself. He may laugh when others laugh and hope not to be asked his opinion too soon. He may learn to copy speech the way he copies documents, taking phrases from his betters until they become his own. That copying can look like imitation. But imitation is one of the ways social worlds reproduce themselves and one of the ways outsiders try to enter them. The coffeehouse is full of borrowed manners. Then there are the political men. Some are office holders, some are connected to office holders, some want to be, and many talk as though the fate of the nation would improve if only their private understanding were adopted by Parliament immediately. They gather around papers and reports with a mixture of concern and appetite. Politics in the coffeehouse is not merely ideology. It is faction, friendship, patronage, rumour, ambition, resentment, and performance. Men are not always asking, what is right? They are asking, what will happen, who will fall, who will rise, who knew first, who looks foolish now, and can this be used? This does not mean they are insincere. Human beings can be sincere and self-interested at the same time. The coffeehouse gives them a place to practice both. For the government, this world of talk is useful and irritating. Coffeehouses spread news quickly, but they also spread criticism. They help form opinion, but not always the opinion authorities want. They allow supporters to circulate arguments, but they allow opponents to do the same. They create places where speeches, taxes, wars, appointments, scandals, and failures can be publicly chewed over by men who have no official right to govern but every confidence in their ability to judge those who do. It is not surprising that informers and government watchers appear in the story. A room full of political talk invites ears that answer to someone outside the room. The spy in a coffeehouse is not necessarily dramatic. He may not wear a cloak, whisper in corners, or carry secrets inside a hidden compartment. He may be a regular who reports occasionally. He may be a man paid to listen for dangerous speech. He may be attached to a faction rather than the state. He may be a servant asked what he has heard. He may be a customer with debts who finds that information can be traded. The important thing is not the romance of espionage. It is the awareness that public speech has consequences. A sentence can travel to places the speaker never intended. A joke against the government can be repeated without the laughter that made it seem harmless. A complaint can be written down in a colder form than it was spoken. The coffeehouse gives speech reach, and reach is never innocent. This possibility changes how men talk. Some become cautious, some become theatrical, some enjoy danger because it makes them feel important. A man may lower his voice not because the information is truly secret, but because lowered voices attract attention. Another may make a bold statement loudly to prove he is not afraid. A third may say, "I will not speak plainly here," which is often a way of speaking very plainly while pretending to refrain. The informer listens to all of this and decides what is worth carrying away. He is not always the cleverest man in the room. He does not need to be. Careless men do much of his work for him. Yet spying is only one form of watching. Everyone watches everyone. The merchant watches the man with shipping news. The printer watches the room's appetite. The writer watches reactions. The clerk watches manners. The political man watches loyalties. The servant watches obstacles. The stranger watches for an opening. The regular watches for changes in the room's balance. The coffeehouse is a school of observation. Its customers may speak of reason, but much of their success depends on reading faces, timing, tone, and silence. The servant's position remains one of the most revealing. He is near everything and acknowledged by almost nothing. He hears the philosophers speak of mankind while ignoring him. He hears merchants speak of risk while he risks hot coffee, sharp words, and sometimes unpaid bills. He hears printers talk of the public while he remains outside the public, being imagined. He may know who drinks too much elsewhere, who cannot pay promptly, who meets whom, who receives letters, who leaves when certain names are mentioned, who pretends to despise gossip while arriving early for it. His knowledge is intimate, but it is not convertible into status in the usual way. The room depends on him without granting him the dignity of importance. If you want to understand the limits of Enlightenment sociability, watch the servant moving through it. There may also be foreigners in the room, and their presence matters. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Vienna, and other cities were connected by travel, letters, trade, diplomacy, exile, study, and print. A foreign visitor in a coffee house could be a curiosity, a source, a target, a performer, or all at once. He might bring news from another capital. He might be asked foolish questions. He might be admired for refinement or mocked for manners. He might confirm English prejudices or disturb them. Coffeehouses helped make the wider world conversational, but conversation often reduces strangers into examples. A Frenchman becomes evidence of France. A Dutch merchant becomes evidence of Dutch thrift. A colonial visitor becomes evidence of the colonies. The room thinks it is learning the world, but it is also sorting the world into convenient shapes. Medical men appear too. Physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and men interested in science could use coffeehouses as places to meet patients, exchange news, discuss cases, advertise lectures, or debate remedies. Medicine in the 18th century was changing, but still full of uncertainty, competing theories and treatments that could be dangerous in themselves. Coffeehouse talk about medicine mixed observation, advertising, skepticism, hope, and quackery. A new remedy might be praised by someone who sold it. A public lecture might promise knowledge of the body. A doctor might gain reputation through conversation as much as through cures. Illness was a constant part of life, and any room full of men would include men worried about their own bodies, even if they disguised worry as curiosity. Clergymen and religious controversialists also belong in the picture. The Enlightenment did not simply replace religion with reason. The relationship was far more complicated. Many religious men participated in learned discussion, scientific curiosity, moral debate, and public print culture. Coffeehouses could host arguments over sermons, toleration, deism, dissent, church authority, miracles, and the moral condition of the age. These were not minor subjects. Religion shaped law, identity, education, politics, and daily life. A clergyman in the coffeehouse might condemn the vanity of public talk, while participating in it with considerable skill. He might worry that skepticism was spreading, or use the tools of reason to defend faith. The room could be irreverent, but it was not simply secular in the modern sense. It was a place where religion became another public argument. This mixture of people did not produce harmony. That is the point. The coffeehouse mattered because it created contact, not because contact was always pleasant. Men of different trades, ranks, educations, and motives sat near enough to irritate one another productively. The merchant might find the philosopher impractical. The philosopher might find the merchant narrow. The printer might find both useful if they could be turned into copy. The clerk might admire them all and gradually discover their weaknesses. The spy might care only which sentence could be reported. The writer might turn everyone into material. The servant might wish they would all move their elbows and pay more quickly. Out of these frictions came the evening's life. There is a danger in imagining this as a single grand conversation. It was more likely many smaller conversations overlapping. At one table, shipping. At another, satire. Near the fire, politics. By the wall, a quiet discussion over a debt. Near the door, someone waiting for a man who has not arrived. A newcomer trying to locate a friend. A regular explaining something inaccurately to a listener too polite to stop him. A pamphlet passed with a warning. A letter, read in part but not shown in full. A laugh travelling farther than the joke that caused it. The coffeehouse is not orderly. It is a network of attention constantly forming and dissolving. And because it is evening, the room's characters loosen as the hours pass. The merchant who was cautious at first speaks more freely after hearing confirmation from another source. The writer who seemed aloof begins to enjoy an audience. The young clerk risks a comment and is relieved when no one destroys him for it. The political man grows sharper. The informer grows more patient. The servant grows more tired. The philosopher, if he is truly one, learns again that ideas do not enter public life in the form he gave them. They are grabbed, shortened, challenged, laughed at, repeated, and used for purposes he did not intend. He may find this frustrating. He may also recognise that an idea without public life is a quieter thing than he wants. By now, the coffee house is not simply a place where people gather. It is a sorting house of social energy. Ambition comes here to test itself. Knowledge comes here to be converted into talk. Trade comes here to reduce distance. Print comes here to become audible. Politics comes here to feel the temperature of the public. Surveillance comes here because power is always interested in rooms where people forget themselves. Labour moves through it carrying cups. Youth comes here to listen. Age comes here to be recognised. The famous and the unknown may pass through the same door, though not with the same freedom. This is why a single evening inside such a place can tell us so much. The Enlightenment was not only a movement of ideas, it was a movement of settings. Ideas require places where they can be encountered, repeated, misunderstood, defended, sold, mocked, and carried away. The coffee house was one of those places. It did not create reason by itself. It did not make men equal. It did not cure ignorance. It did not dissolve prejudice. It did not remove greed, vanity, or fear from public life. But it gave more men more chances to behave as if the world beyond their private obligations was open to discussion. That behaviour, repeated often enough, becomes historically important. The young clerk has finally spoken. It was only one sentence, perhaps a question about the source of a report, perhaps a modest correction drawn from something he copied at work. For a moment the table turns toward him. This is the dangerous gift of the coffee house. It can make a man visible before he is ready. His face warms. He wonders whether he has overstepped. One older man answers him seriously, which is better than praise. Another dismisses the point, but not cruelly. The conversation moves on. Still, something has changed for the young man. He has entered the room not only with his body, but with his voice. Tomorrow he may be silent again, but he will remember that the boundary moved once. Across the room, the servant clears a dish and hears the same exchange without looking up. The printer notices that the argument has shifted toward a subject worth watching. The merchant checks the time because information is useful only if acted upon soon enough. The political man leans back, measuring the company. The informer stores a name he may never need. The writer smiles slightly because human vanity has once again performed exactly as expected. The philosopher, if he is present, may be trying to decide whether public reason is strengthened or damaged by being handed over to a room like this. He will not settle the question tonight. The candles are lower now, and the smoke has thickened into something that feels almost solid near the ceiling. Some men leave, pulling on coats and returning to the street with pieces of the evening inside them. Others arrive late and ask what has been said. As if conversation can be summarised without loss, it cannot, but men try. The room repeats itself for newcomers, altering the order, sharpening some points, dropping others. This is how memory becomes version. By morning, several different accounts of the same evening may exist, each one carried by a man certain that his is the useful one. And yet, even in this crowded male world, even in this noisy public room that seems so alive with exchange, there is another question waiting just outside the candlelight. Who is missing? Who does not get to pay the penny and sit without comment? Who serves but does not speak? Who is discussed but not admitted? Who appears in the newspapers as property, scandal, servant, wife, actress, queen, criminal, or curiosity, but not as an equal participant in the argument? The coffee house made a new kind of public life possible, but every public draws a line around itself. To understand the room honestly, we have to stop looking only at the men who filled it and turn toward the door, because the door tells the truth about any society. It shows not only who is welcomed inside, but who must remain outside, listening to the noise through the wall. The door tells the truth about any society, not the speeches made inside, not the slogans men repeat when they want to sound generous, not the flattering descriptions written later by people who enjoyed the room and remembered it from the best seat near the fire. The door tells the truth because a door has only two sides. You're either able to pass through it without causing surprise, or you are not. You're either treated as a customer, a servant, a curiosity, a threat, a joke, or someone who's made a mistake by entering. So before we admire the coffeehouse too warmly, before we let the candlelight and the newspapers and the noise of argument convince us that this was a simple birthplace of modern freedom, we need to stand at the threshold for a while and watch who comes in, who hesitates, who works there, who is spoken about, and who remains outside while the room congratulates itself on being open to the world. The coffeehouse loved to describe itself as open. That was part of its mythology from very early on. A man paid his penny, entered, drank, read, listened, spoke if he had the nerve, and for a short while could imagine himself part of the larger conversation of the age. This was the source of its nickname, the Penny University, and there was truth in that. Coffeehouses did create spaces where men from different ranks could sit closer together than they might in many other settings. They gave access to newspapers, pamphlets, commercial reports, and public talk. In a city shaped by rank, patronage, wealth, and inherited authority that mattered. But openness is never a simple condition. It always has rules. Sometimes they are posted. More often they are enforced by glances, jokes, silence, seating, accent, clothing, and the quick social punishment that falls on anyone who misunderstands the room. The first rule was so obvious to the men inside that they rarely had to state it. The coffeehouse was overwhelmingly a male public space. Not because every woman was legally forbidden from crossing the threshold in every situation. The reality was more complicated than that. Historians have pointed out that women were not entirely absent from coffeehouse culture. Some women owned or managed coffeehouses. Women worked in them, served in them, sold printed material around them, appeared in satire about them, and shaped the world of print and gossip that fed them. There were even famous coffee women in London whose names became public enough to be mocked, admired, or turned into characters in the city's imagination. But the respectable female customer, the woman who entered as an equal participant in debate, sat with the newspapers, and joined the argument as men did, was not the ordinary expectation of the English coffeehouse. The public culture of the coffeehouse was built around masculine sociability, and women's presence in that world was limited, contested, and often interpreted through questions of propriety, reputation, and sexual suspicion. Scholars still debate the extent and meaning of women's participation in early coffeehouse culture, but there is broad agreement that gender shaped who could be present and how that presence was read. This is worth slowing down for because it reveals one of the central contradictions of the coffeehouse. The men inside might speak of reason as universal. They might discuss mankind, liberty, improvement, public virtue, and the rights of Englishmen. But the actual public they created in that room was not universal. It was masculine. A woman could be the subject of a joke, the owner of the establishment, the person carrying coffee, the seller of newspapers, the widow whose property was discussed, the actress whose reputation had become gossip, the queen whose politics appeared in print, the wife waiting at home, or the imagined author of a satirical complaint. But she was not usually welcomed as one of the ordinary voices around the table. The room claimed to be opened by talent, wit, and money. Yet it treated gender as a boundary before conversation even began. There is a temptation here to make the women outside sound silent, but that would be another mistake. They were not silent. They spoke in other places, through other networks, in markets, churches, homes, shops, print shops, theatres, correspondence, and sometimes through print itself. Women bought, read, borrowed, circulated and discussed books and periodicals. Women participated in salon culture in parts of Europe, especially in France, where elite women could shape intellectual sociability in ways very different from the English coffeehouse. Women were readers, writers, patrons, printers, booksellers, political observers, religious thinkers, and managers of households whose economic decisions mattered. The coffeehouse did not contain all public life. It contained a particular version of public life, and that version often pretended to be larger than it was. Still, the exclusion hurt the meaning of the room. Think about a London wife in the late 17th or early 18th century whose husband spends long evenings at the coffeehouse. He leaves the household after business or dinner, pays his penny, sits among other men, reads news, speaks politics, and returns with the smell of smoke and coffee in his clothes. He may say he's been improving his understanding of the world. She may think he's been avoiding home, wasting money, repeating rumours, and coming back with opinions sharper than his usefulness. This tension appeared in satire. The famous 1674 pamphlet known as the Women's Petition Against Coffee mocked the new drink and complained, in comic and exaggerated language, that coffee houses were drawing men away from women and domestic duties. The pamphlet itself was satirical, not a simple record of women's collective political action, but it shows that the gendered anxiety around coffeehouse culture was visible very early. There is something funny about that pamphlet until you sit with the household behind it. The husband says the coffeehouse is where he hears the news. The wife knows the fire still needs tending, accounts still need keeping, children still need managing, servants still need supervising, meals still need planning, clothing still needs mending, and bills still need paying. He may return with talk of Europe balanced in his head, and no awareness that someone else has balanced the household in his absence. The Enlightenment's public conversation often depended on private labour that it did not name. Men could gather to discuss the world partly because women, servants, apprentices and workers were holding other parts of life steady. That does not make the conversations false, but it makes them less innocent. Now look again at the women who did enter the room as workers or proprietors. The coffee woman is a complicated figure. If she owns or manages the house, she has authority of a practical kind. She may know the regulars, the politics of the room, the debts, the quarrels, the rumours, the profitable customers, and the dangerous ones. She may control the supply of coffee, candles, papers, and servants. She may decide when to tolerate noise and when to end it. She may be sharper than many of the men who sit in judgment around her tables, but her authority is not the same as equality within the conversation. Her presence is often sexualized, satirized, or treated as socially suspect. A woman in charge of a public room full of men could be powerful and vulnerable at the same time. The room needed her labour and business sense, yet it might refuse her the status it gave to male customers who did far less to keep the place alive. The female hawker or seller of printed matter occupies another edge of the coffeehouse world. She may not be seated inside, but she helps feed the appetite that makes the room work. Street sellers, ballad sellers, pamphlet sellers, and women involved in the lower levels of the print trade shaped what people encountered. Paula McDowell's work on women in the London literary marketplace has emphasised that women were not merely passive carriers of male political writing. They helped shape circulation and understood customers' desire for news and print. That matters because circulation is power. The person who carries the paper may influence what reaches the room, even if the room does not invite her to interpret it from the table. Class marked the doorway too. The coffeehouse liked the idea that a penny lowered social barriers, but one coin could not erase the body that carried it. Clothing spoke before a man did. Shoes, cuffs, wig, posture, accent, cleanliness, confidence, and the ease with which he handled the room all told a story. A gentleman could enter as if space would be made for him. A prosperous tradesman might enter with confidence built from money and regular use. A clerk might enter carefully, hoping his coat and manners did not betray too much uncertainty. An apprentice might enter with excitement and fear mixed together. A poor labouring man, if he entered at all, might find the room technically open but socially inhospitable. The price was only one barrier. The performance required after paying was another. This is the difference between admission and belonging. Admission means the door opens. Belonging means the room does not ask why you are there. The coffeehouse admitted more men than many elite institutions, but it did not treat all admitted men alike. A young clerk could sit near a merchant, but that did not mean his words carried equal weight. A tradesman could hear a gentleman speak foolishly, but the room might still laugh more kindly at the gentleman. A stranger might have the right to speak, but not the right to be heard seriously. Rank survived inside the coffee house because rank does not need walls to survive. It lives in habits. It lives in who interrupts and who is interrupted. It lives in which man may be eccentric and which man is merely rude. It lives in whose ignorance is forgiven and whose ignorance confirms what others already assumed. The seating itself could reveal this. Men did not always sit by formal rank, but regularity produced its own order. The best seat near the fire may belong informally to a man who arrives every evening and is useful to the house. The paper may be passed first to certain customers. Some men are asked for opinions, others must offer theirs carefully. The doorway may be a place for the uncertain and the late. The inner table may belong to established voices. A man can learn this arrangement only by watching, and watching is what newcomers do. The coffee house teaches hierarchy while speaking of conversation. Servants complicate the story even more. They are inside and outside at once. They move through the room physically, but socially they are not part of the public being celebrated. A servant may hear political arguments, commercial secrets, philosophical claims, literary gossip and private insults. He may carry the dish that allows a man to speak for another hour about liberty. He may trim the candle by which a pamphlet attacking tyranny is read. He may clean the table where men have discussed the rights of mankind. Yet if he joins the argument without permission, the room may treat it as insolence. His ears are useful, his hands necessary, his judgment invisible. The coffee house is full of such contradictions because 18th century society is full of them. An enslaved or formerly enslaved person in or around this world exposes a still deeper contradiction. In England itself, the legal and social status of black people in the 18th century was complex and contested, but black servants, sailors, musicians and workers were present in London and other cities. The Atlantic goods consumed in coffee houses were tied to empire and plantation labour. Coffee, sugar and tobacco connected the room to systems of slavery and colonial exploitation that many customers either accepted, ignored, or discussed only when politically useful. A man might stir sugar into his coffee while speaking of natural rights. He might read a newspaper advertisement concerning enslaved people or colonial goods and then turn to an essay on liberty without feeling the contradiction as sharply as we do. The contradiction was there whether he felt it or not. The coffee house was not outside empire. It tasted of it. This is one of the reasons the coffee house must be remembered as both progressive and compromised. It widened certain forms of discussion while resting on narrow definitions of who counted as a full participant. It helped spread criticism of authority while benefiting from global systems of authority and coercion. It made print more public while leaving many people represented in print only as servants, property, criminals, dependents, or objects of curiosity. It allowed some men to imagine themselves citizens of a thinking public, while other people's labour made that imagination comfortable. If we tell only the flattering half, we miss the room itself. Foreigners had a different kind of uncertain status. A foreign man might be welcomed if he brought news, commercial connections, wit, or fashionable polish. He might also be mocked, distrusted, stereotyped, or treated as a living example of his nation. A French visitor could become a subject before he became a person. A Dutch merchant might be reduced to thrift. A Jewish broker might be useful in financial circles and still face prejudice. A colonial visitor could be asked to confirm English assumptions about the colonies. An Ottoman or African presence could become exoticized in a room drinking a beverage that had arrived in England through trade routes linking Europe to the wider world. The coffee house prided itself on news from abroad, but it did not always meet actual people from abroad with equal imagination. Religion could mark the doorway too. The coffee house was not a church, and that was part of its appeal, but religious identity mattered in 18th century Britain. Anglicans, dissenters, Catholics, Jews, deists, skeptics, and freethinkers occupied different legal and social positions. Some coffeehouses were associated with particular circles or tendencies. A dissenting minister might use such spaces differently from an Anglican gentleman. A suspected Catholic might attract suspicion in periods of anti-Catholic anxiety. A freethinker might find eager listeners or dangerous enemies depending on the room. The coffeehouse allowed religious debate, but it did not dissolve the force of religious prejudice. It gave it another setting. Political identity also shaped access. A Whig coffeehouse and a Tory coffeehouse might feel like different countries within the same city. A man could enter the wrong room and discover that news is not received neutrally anywhere. The facts may be the same, but the mood around them changes. One house treats a minister's difficulty as national danger. Another treats it as justice. One room laughs at a pamphlet. Another buys extra copies. A man known for one allegiance might not be physically barred from another faction's room, but he may be watched, baited, mocked, or frozen out. The coffeehouse was public, but publics can be partisan. Being allowed inside does not mean being allowed comfort. There were also gradations of respectability. The polite coffeehouse was not the only kind. Some houses were associated with literary refinement, finance, shipping, politics, or respectable sociability. Others had rougher reputations. Molking's Coffee House in Covent Garden, for example, became notorious in 18th century London for its association with late-night sociability, prostitution, thieves, actors, writers, and disorderly urban life. It reminds us that coffee house was not one social form. A respectable merchant's coffee house and a notorious late-night house belonged to the same broad culture, but didn't offer the same experience or attract the same assumptions. The door of each house carried a different message. To be seen entering one might improve a man's reputation. To be seen entering another might complicate it. Respectability was especially unforgiving toward women. A man could spend an evening in a questionable coffee house and perhaps turn it into a joke. A woman seen in the wrong public space could find the judgment heavier. This imbalance shaped movement through the city. Men had more freedom to occupy public rooms without immediate damage to their names. Women's presence was interpreted more narrowly, especially if they were not working, escorted, elite enough to bend the rules, or already placed beyond conventional respectability by occupational reputation. A coffee house could be physically accessible and socially dangerous at the same time. The door also separated the literate from the less literate, though not completely. Because newspapers and pamphlets were often read aloud, a man did not need perfect reading ability to participate in coffeehouse news culture. That made the room more inclusive than silent print alone. Hearing could substitute for reading, but literacy still mattered. The man who could read the paper himself had an advantage. The man who could quote from books had standing. The man who could write letters, pamphlets, accounts, petitions, or replies had tools others lacked. The coffeehouse softened the boundary of literacy without removing it. It made print audible, but it did not give every listener equal command of print. Age mattered too. Older men carried authority by habit. Younger men entered as learners, imitators, challengers, or annoyances. An apprentice might sit quietly for months before risking a strong opinion. A student might feel brave because university life had trained him in argument, only to discover that coffeehouse men did not reward arguments the same way tutors did. A young writer might want attention before he had earned patience. The room could be generous to youth when youth was witty, useful, or connected. It could be cruel when youth was merely eager. To be allowed inside as a young man did not mean being treated as fully formed. Now step outside the door for a moment. The street hears the coffeehouse before it sees it clearly. Light leaks through the window. Voices rise and fall behind wood and glass. A woman passes carrying something needed at home. A servant waits for a master. A printer's boy hurries toward another house with papers under his arm. A poor man looks in and keeps moving. A woman selling small goods may pause near the entrance, close enough to know the traffic of customers but not part of the talk within. A coachman waits in the cold while his employer warms himself inside. The public sphere has a weather system around it, made of people who support it, observe it, serve it, resent it, and are excluded from its self-description. The men inside do not necessarily see this. Every public tends to mistake itself for the public. The coffeehouse regular knows the room, knows the names, knows the papers, knows the jokes, and begins to feel that this is where opinion lives. But opinion also lives elsewhere, in kitchens, markets, workshops, churches, taverns, bookstalls, theatres, drawing rooms, servants' halls, ships, barracks, print shops, and streets. The coffeehouse is important, but not total. It is one chamber of a larger organism. Its mistake, and sometimes the historian's mistake, is to treat the voices nearest the newspapers as the only voices that mattered. There is a useful correction in remembering the household. While men sit in the coffeehouse discussing public events, households are also interpreting those events. A tax becomes the price of goods. A war becomes absence, enlistment, debt, mourning, profit, or fear. A pamphlet becomes something read aloud at home. A newspaper report becomes worry over a son at sea. A merchant's decision made after coffeehouse talk becomes work for clerks, dock workers, sailors, servants, and families. Public conversation does not stay public. It enters private life in practical forms. The people left outside the coffeehouse are not outside history. They are often the ones who live with the consequences of what men inside call policy, trade, and national interest. That is why the doorway matters so much. It shows that the coffeehouse was both a new opening and a guarded space. It opened conversation for certain men who might otherwise have remained farther from news and debate. It allowed social mixing across some lines. It made information more available. It helped train habits of public judgment. These are real achievements, but it also guarded conversation against full participation by women, servants, the poor, many workers, and people whose race, religion, foreignness or reputation made their presence conditional. It did not create equality. It created a more flexible inequality, one that allowed movement in some directions while blocking others. The men inside would not all have agreed with this description. Some would have said the coffeehouse was open to anyone who could pay and behave. That answer sounds reasonable until we ask who was allowed to define behaviour. Respectable behaviour was not neutral. It was coded by gender, class, race, religion, accent, clothing, and occupation. A gentleman's loud confidence might be called spirit. A servant's might be called insolence. A writer's sharpness might be called wit. A poor man's might be called rudeness. A foreigner's hesitation might be read as stupidity. A woman's presence might be read before she spoke. The same act changes meaning depending on the body performing it. The coffeehouse was not immune to that. It was built from it. Inside, the evening continues without waiting for our analysis. The papers are still on the table. The candles still need trimming. The coffee still arrives hot and bitter. Men still argue about liberty while benefiting from exclusions they barely name. The young clerk still hopes to speak again. The merchant still listens for advantage. The printer still watches the room's appetite. The servant still hears everything. A woman at the counter or in the back room may understand the business better than most of the men understand the nation. Yet her understanding is not the one the room will remember. Outside, others pass by and hear the sound of public life without being welcomed into its centre. There is something important in not turning away from this discomfort. It does not destroy the coffeehouse's historical significance. It makes that significance more exact. The coffeehouse helped form the modern world not because it was pure, but because it was partial and powerful at the same time. Modern public life has often worked this way. It declares broad ideals in rooms built by narrow access. It speaks of reason while shaped by status. It invites debate while policing who may debate. It expands participation and protects privilege in the same movement. The 18th century coffeehouse lets us see that pattern early, with unusual clarity, because the room is small enough to watch. By now, the doorway has become less simple. It is not merely the place where customers enter. It is the line between ideal and practice. Inside, men imagine a public made by conversation. At the threshold, society decides who counts as conversational. Outside, those left out continue living, working, reading, selling, serving, repeating, resisting, and shaping the world in ways the coffeehouse may not acknowledge. The noise inside is real, but it is not the only noise of the age. The evening moves on. Some of the men who have spoken most confidently will soon leave and return to households where women manage the consequences of male absence. Servants will clean the cups and tables after the talk of improvement has ended. A printer's boy will carry another sheet into another room. A rumour born here will cross into spaces where the original speakers would not think to look for it. A woman who never sat at the table may hear the same news tomorrow and understand its practical meaning faster than the men who debated its principles tonight. A poor worker, who could not comfortably enter, may still feel the price changes discussed inside. The door closes and opens, and each time it reveals the shape of the world more honestly than any speech about openness could do. When the last full hour of the coffeehouse evening approaches, the exclusions do not vanish, but the room changes again. The respectable daytime edges soften. The men who remain are not always the same men who came early. The talk becomes looser, riskier, sometimes sharper, sometimes more tired. The papers are worn, the candles are shorter, the servants are watching the hour. Outside, the city has entered its night economy of watchmen, thieves, late coaches, taverns, lodging houses, and people trying to get home without trouble. Inside, one more cup may be poured, one more argument begun, one more rumour carried out into the dark. And in that late hour, when the coffeehouse is no longer simply a place of news, but a place reluctant to release the men who have spent the evening inside it, we can see how the room sends its thoughts back into the city, not as finished philosophy, not as clean truth, but as talk, memory, suspicion, ambition, and the strange confidence of people who believe that by speaking together under candlelight they have touched the edge of the modern world. The last full hour of the coffeehouse evening does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly. A man notices first that the newest newspaper has already been handled by everyone who truly wanted it. The loudest political argument has lost some of its force because the same 3 points have circled the table twice, and even the men making them can feel the edges wearing down. A candle near the wall has burned so low that the flame sits in a small cup of melted tallow, struggling when the door opens. The servant has begun to move differently, not rushing exactly, but counting tusks with his body, cups to collect, tables to wipe, fires to manage, men to encourage gently toward departure without offending those who think departure should never be suggested to them. The room is still alive, but it is no longer at its brightest. It has entered that late stage of the evening when public talk becomes looser, more personal, more tired, and sometimes more honest than it meant to be. Outside, the city has changed. The daytime economy of shops, carts, callers, clerks, apprentices, porters, and market women has thinned into something darker and more uncertain. Watchmen begin their rounds, carrying lanterns and calling the hour into streets where not everyone welcomes authority, and not everyone fears it. Coaches still move, but less often. Footsteps matter more after dark because there are fewer of them. A man leaving a coffeehouse late must think about the route home in a way we rarely do now. Which streets are well lit? Which alleys should be avoided? Is he carrying money? Is he sober enough to keep his feet? Does he have company? Has the rain made the stones slick? Does he know the district well? Or has conversation kept him until the hour when the familiar city becomes a place of corners and shadows? The coffeehouse door, which earlier promised entry into the world, now opens back into the practical problem of getting home. Inside, though, there is always someone reluctant to leave. This is another thing about public rooms that does not change much across centuries. The man who has had a good evening wants it extended. The man who has spoken well wants another chance to be admired. The man who has lost an argument wants one more turn. The man waiting for news still believes someone may arrive with it. The lonely man prefers the discomfort of a crowded room to the quiet of his lodging. The ambitious young clerk does not want to surrender the feeling that he has been near important things. The writer waits to see whether one more phrase will appear before the fire drops. The merchant lingers because he has learned that late information can be the most useful kind. The informer, if one is present, knows that men near closing may say what they guarded earlier. Fatigue lowers defences. So does vanity. So does the simple human wish to finish the evening by being right. Coffee is poured again, though it may no longer be fresh. The last cup before midnight is rarely the best cup. It may be bitter from standing too long, thick at the bottom, and hotter than pleasant because boiling has become easier than care. But men still drink it. They drink it because the ritual matters as much as the taste. Calling for another dish of coffee is a way of saying the evening is not yet over. It buys time. It gives the hand something to hold while the mind decides whether to remain in public or return to private life. It gives a man the small authority of a customer still being served. In the coffee house, as in many places, the person who orders one more thing is trying to delay the moment when the room no longer belongs to him. The conversation now begins to change shape. Earlier, the room spoke outward. It reached toward Parliament, the Royal Exchange, the docks, Amsterdam, Paris, Jamaica, Boston, Bengal, the Fleet, the Ministry, the latest pamphlet, the newest experiment, the rumour that had arrived from another house. Late in the evening, those large subjects remain, but they begin to attach themselves to particular lives. A tax becomes not merely a policy, but a grievance spoken through a merchant's accounts. A war becomes not only strategy, but a son at sea, a brother in uniform, a customer lost, a debt delayed. A philosophical claim about human nature becomes an insult when applied to the man across the table. A debate about liberty becomes sharper when someone asks whose liberty is meant. The later the hour, the harder it becomes to keep everything safely abstract. This is one reason the coffeehouse mattered so much. It did not keep ideas in the clean form in which writers sometimes preferred them. It dirtied them with use. A theory of government met the man who had to pay taxes. A theory of commerce met the ship owner waiting for news of cargo. A theory of reason met the regular who could not stop interrupting. A theory of improvement met the servant cleaning spilled coffee from the table. A theory of universal mankind met the fact that women were mostly absent from the argument, that servants heard more than they could say, that colonial goods sat in the cups and pipes and sweetened dishes of men who spoke proudly of freedom. The coffeehouse did not resolve these contradictions. It exposed them, sometimes without understanding what it had exposed, and yet from such rooms came habits that would become difficult to remove from modern life. The habit of expecting news, the habit of discussing public affairs outside official settings, the habit of judging leaders in ordinary conversation, the habit of reading printed arguments quickly and answering them quickly, the habit of imagining strangers as possible participants in a shared discussion, the habit of treating opinion almost as a possession, something a man carried, displayed, defended, revised, or refused to revise even when he should. These habits are so familiar now that they feel natural, but they had histories. They had places where people practiced them. The 18th century coffeehouse was one of those places. It is important not to exaggerate. The modern mind was not born in one room, or in one city, or among one group of men drinking coffee under bad light. No serious history should claim that. The changes we associate with the Enlightenment came through universities, academies, printing houses, laboratories, churches, courts, clubs, salons, correspondence networks, lecture halls, workshops, households, voyages, markets, and political crises. They came through conflict as much as conversation. They came through empire, war, finance, science, religious argument, and the daily work of people whose names were never printed. But the coffeehouse gave many of those forces a visible evening form. It made the movement of information feel social. It let men experience the world as something arriving at the table and requiring response. That response is the key. Before a man has responded, he is only a receiver of news. After he responds, even foolishly, he has entered public life. He has made a judgment. He has risked correction. He has placed himself in relation to others. The coffeehouse encouraged that risk. It asked men to become interpreters. Not all were good at it. Many were careless, many were vain, many repeated what they had not understood. But the expectation that one should have something to say about the world beyond the household was itself a modern habit. It trained people to think of public events as available to public judgment. That did not make them democratic in the full sense. It did not give everyone a vote, a voice, or equal standing. But it changed the posture of those included. They no longer merely heard decisions, they talked back to them. Late in the evening, this talking back can sound grand or ridiculous depending on the table. A man who has never held office explains exactly how the ministry should conduct war. Another who has never crossed the Channel speaks with confidence about France. A third who has never managed more than his own debts explains national finance. This is comic, and the coffeehouse deserves the comedy. But beneath it lies something serious. Public judgment often begins in presumption. People speak before they know enough because waiting until one knows enough would silence nearly everyone. The hope of a thinking public is not that every first opinion will be wise, but that opinions will meet resistance, evidence, correction, and memory. The coffeehouse provided some of that. Not perfectly, not fairly, not for everyone, but enough to make opinion a shared activity rather than a private murmur. The newspapers on the table have done their work. They have created a temporary common world. Men who may disagree sharply are at least disagreeing about some of the same reports. This matters more than it sounds. A public needs shared objects of attention. Without them, conversation scatters into private certainties that cannot meet. The coffeehouse paper gives the room a starting point. Here is the report. Here is the speech. Here is the notice. Here is the price. Here is the rumour printed carefully enough to appear respectable. Now what do we make of it? That question is the coffeehouse's real product. Not coffee, not newspapers, not even talk. The product is the repeated act of asking what public information means. By the late 18th century, that act could become politically dangerous in new ways. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, debates over rights, empire, representation, dissent, press freedom, and reform all intensified the relationship between print, public gathering, and authority. Coffeehouses, clubs, taverns, reading societies, and similar spaces became part of a wider world in which governments had to pay attention to opinion as a force. Not simply the opinion of aristocrats or office holders, but opinion circulating among readers, merchants, tradesmen, writers, and politically alert citizens. The state could censor, prosecute, spy, subsidize friendly writers, or try to flood the public with official versions of events, but could not easily return to a world in which public discussion did not exist. Once people have learned to gather around news, they do not forget the habit quickly. The men inside may not understand that they are practicing a new form of power. They are more likely thinking about tonight's argument, tomorrow's business, the insult they should have answered better, the pamphlet they want to buy, the rumour they hope is true, the man they distrust, the debt they must pay, the walk home. History is often built from people not knowing the larger name for what they are doing. The coffeehouse regular does not say, "I am helping create a public sphere." He says, "What papers have come?" He says, "Did you hear?" He says, "That cannot be right." He says, "I have it from a man who knows." He says, Read that line again. He says, "You are mistaken." Out of such ordinary phrases, repeated nightly, a culture of public argument takes shape. The last cup cools. The man holding it has stopped drinking. The surface of the coffee reflects a small, trembling candle flame. Around him, the room begins to loosen its hold on the evening. One customer folds a paper and places it down with exaggerated care, as if order at the table can impose order on the world. Another pushes back from the bench and winces because his legs have stiffened. A third searches for his gloves. Someone calls for his hat. Someone asks whether the report will be confirmed by morning, and another replies that by morning there will be 3 new reports and no more certainty than before. That line gets a tired laugh because it is probably true. The servant collects cups with the relief of a person nearing the end of visible labour, and the beginning of cleaning no customer will praise. The room does not empty evenly. Public spaces rarely do. The cautious leave first, or the men with families expecting them, or the men whose business requires a clear head at dawn. The talkers remain. The young remain if they can. The lonely remain until remaining becomes conspicuous. The men with secrets leave in pairs or not together, depending on how secret the secret must appear. The informer leaves when he has enough or when the night offers nothing more. The keeper watches the room's value decline. Every establishment has a moment when customers stop being profitable and become obstacles to closing. That moment is delicate. A good keeper manages it without turning regulars into enemies. A poor one loses trade by making men feel unwelcome in a place they have mistaken for their own. There is something revealing about that mistake. Many regulars do feel the coffee house belongs to them. They have sat there for years. They know the staff, the tables, the papers, the arguments, the jokes, the draught by the window, the man who lies, the man who knows ships, the man who pretends to know books, the man who always arrives too late and asks for the beginning. They have invested time, attention, and identity in the room. But it is still a business. The sense of belonging has been purchased repeatedly, penny by penny, cup by cup, evening by evening. Public life often works like that. People come to feel ownership over spaces they do not own because those spaces hold their habits. The coffee house is one of the places where men learn that feeling in relation to news and opinion. When a man finally steps outside, the street air strikes him differently. After hours of smoke, even dirty city air can feel sharp. The sounds change. The coffee house behind him is muffled now, reduced to a glow and a murmur. The argument that seemed so large inside becomes part of the city's background. He pulls his coat tighter and begins walking. Perhaps he's going home, perhaps to lodgings, perhaps to another public house, because not every man accepts an evening's natural end. He carries news with him. Some of it is printed, some of it is rumour, some of it is merely the memory of how others reacted. He may repeat a sentence tomorrow and forget where he first heard it. He may act on a report. He may write a letter. He may buy a pamphlet. He may change nothing except his sense that he is a man who knows what is being said. That sense matters. It can be the beginning of confidence, and confidence can become political. Inside, the servant wipes the table where the newspaper lay. This image should stay with us because it brings the whole evening back to earth. After all the arguments about liberty, trade, reason, empire, science, ministry, corruption, and human nature, someone must remove the rings left by cups. Someone must gather broken pipe stems. Someone must deal with ash, spilled coffee, candle grease, muddy footprints, and the tired disorder of public life after the public has gone home. The modern mind, if we want to use that phrase, was not born in clean abstraction. It left stains. It required maintenance. It was served by people excluded from its highest claims. It was made possible by materials gathered from across the world, by labour visible and invisible, by print, by trade, by ambition, by habit, by curiosity, and by the stubborn human pleasure of telling another person that he is wrong. The candles are put out one by one, and the room changes instantly. A space that seemed public a moment ago becomes merely furniture in darkness. Tables, benches, hearth, counter, shelves, papers set aside for tomorrow, cups stacked, floor cooling. Without voices, the coffee house is less impressive. This is useful to notice. The importance of the place was never only in its walls. It existed when people gathered and made use of it. Public life is an activity, not a decoration. A coffee house without talk is only a room that smells of smoke. Tomorrow, when the fire is stirred, the water heated, the first papers brought in, and the first customer steps through the door, the public will have to be made again. That daily remaking is one of the most important things about the Enlightenment as lived experience. It was not simply an era when certain great books appeared. It was an era when practices accumulated. Reading regularly, corresponding widely, attending lectures, joining societies, visiting coffee houses, buying pamphlets, discussing experiments, comparing governments, criticising ministers, observing manners, sorting truth from rumour, or trying to, imagining improvement, distrusting old authorities while creating new ones. These practices trained attention. They shaped what people thought they were entitled to know and discuss. The coffee house was one place where that training became social and habitual. We still live with the consequences, not in a simple line, because history never gives us simple lines, but in recognisable habits. We still gather around news. We still mistake speed for understanding. We still use public conversation to measure status. We still argue with strangers. We still trust sources partly because of who shared them. We still belong to rooms, physical or digital, where information becomes identity. We still confuse being informed with being wise. We still hope that discussion can improve us and fear that it may only make us louder. The 18th century coffee house feels distant because of its candles, wigs, clay pipes, muddy streets, bitter boiled coffee, and printed sheets passed under smoky light. It feels close because the people inside are doing something we understand immediately. They are trying to make sense of the world together while bringing all their vanity, intelligence, prejudice, curiosity, fear, wit, and self-interest with them. That may be the most honest way to understand the birth of the modern mind. It was not born as a calm, finished thing. It did not arrive with perfect reason and clean hands. It emerged through crowded habits of attention, through men reading aloud before they fully understood, through merchants needing facts quickly, through printers turning quarrels into paper, through clerks listening their way into confidence, through philosophers watching their ideas become common property, and sometimes common nonsense, through servants hearing the gap between principles and practice, through women excluded from certain rooms but active in other networks of reading, labour, business and judgment, through empire entering the cup while liberty entered the sentence, through public talk that was both an opening and a boundary. Near midnight the last man leaves or is persuaded to leave. The door shuts, the street takes him. The coffeehouse keeper checks what must be checked before sleep. The remaining heat fades. The room will smell of old smoke by morning. Somewhere in the city, a man repeats a rumour he heard there. Somewhere else, a printer decides a subject has enough life left for another sheet. A merchant wakes early with a decision already forming from last night's report. A clerk carries a phrase into his work. A woman hears the news at second hand and measures it against the needs of the household. A servant who cleaned the room knows which gentlemen spoke bravely and which ones did not pay promptly. The coffee house is closed, but the evening has not stopped moving. And this is the part I find most worth remembering when we imagine those rooms now. The coffee house did not matter because it was pure or wise or fair. It mattered because it made conversation durable. It took the passing talk of men and attached it to newspapers, routines, reputations, businesses, habits and places. It gave ideas somewhere to gather before they had institutions strong enough to carry them. It gave ordinary customers the feeling, sometimes justified and sometimes laughable, that they had a right to discuss the condition of the world. That feeling once learned does not stay small. It follows people home. It enters letters. It shapes what they read next. It changes how they listen when authority speaks. It makes silence feel less natural. So when you picture an Enlightenment coffeehouse at the end of the evening, do not picture only famous men saying clever things. Picture the worn table after they have gone. Picture the candle grease. Picture the stained newspaper. Picture the servant's tired hands. Picture the last cup cooling and almost empty. Picture the door opening onto a dark street where the city is still awake in pieces. Picture the conversation leaving in the coats and pockets, and memories of men who will repeat it imperfectly tomorrow. That is where much of history lives, not only in the first statement of an idea, but in its repetition, its distortion, its argument, its journey from one room to another. And later, much later, when coffee becomes ordinary enough to lose its danger, when newspapers become daily companions, when public debate moves into clubs, parliaments, lecture halls, salons, reading rooms, radio studios, television panels, comment sections, and glowing screens held in the palm of the hand, the old coffeehouse remains there underneath the habit. A room full of people, a piece of news, a drink, a claim, an objection, a laugh, a rumour, a correction, a silence after someone says too much. The furniture changes, the light changes, the speed changes, but the human scene is still recognisable. Someone has brought news. Someone doubts it. Someone wants to profit from it. Someone wants to print it. Someone wants to be seen understanding it. Someone has been left out of the room. Someone is cleaning up after everyone else. And somewhere near the centre of it all, one more voice leans forward and says, with complete confidence, "Now here is what it means, is what